are listening to MINDSHOCK. This is your host, Bruce McGuire, and we are delving into video game conspiracies today with the infamous urban legend, Polybius. This has been a highly requested topic to dissect in typical MINDSHOCK fashion with logic and reason at the forefront, going down every rabbit hole regarding this fascinating case of the arcade game that never was, allegedly. As always, if you enjoy the MINDSHOCK podcast, find it interesting and informative, want to help support the podcast, you can donate to our PayPal. Just check the link in the description. You can also become a YouTube member right here on YouTube for access to exclusive streams and chats. Make sure you subscribe to the channel, hit that bell for notifications, like and share Twitter, Facebook, Reddit, Patreon. Patrons do get priority for case topic, logical analysis, co-podcast requests. You could also be a guest on the podcast depending on your tier. Questions, comments, theories, thoughts, suggestions, rebuttals, debunkings of any kind, leave them in the comment section, particularly if you remember playing Polybius. And I'll be getting into calls for action here for people who either remember playing Polybius, knew someone who played it, or were at least active in the late 80s, mid to late 80s, early 90s BBS boards on the early versions of the internet, where apparently it's really hard to search for them unless they've been copied and uploaded to websites. It's hard to find any of these BBS posts, but I would be curious to know if this was ever discussed prior to the year 2000 and those that point to this all being an urban legend or some kind of a hoax, or is the real truth that it's a mix, some kind of mix of both? So let's set the stage here with the basic Wikipedia article, and then we will be diving deep into every aspect of this fascinating mystery. Polybius is an urban legend concerning a fictitious 1981 arcade game. I like how Wikipedia definitively states whether something is fictitious or not, because if it was real, even if only for a week or even for a day in a random arcade that only a couple people might have had access to, how would Wikipedia know that it was fictitious? Again, the cult of authority worship it's in full force at Wikipedia. Wikipedia, of course, a lot of nonsense on Wikipedia, maintaining the narrative of the establishment. The legend describes the game as part of a government-run, crowdsourced psychology experiment based in Portland, Oregon. Gameplay supposedly produced intense psychoactive and addictive effects in the player. These few publicly staged arcade machines were said to have been visited periodically by men in black for the purpose of data mining the machines and analyzing these effects. Allegedly, all of these Polybius arcade machines disappeared from the arcade market. The urban legend has persisted in video game journalism, and through continued interest, it inspired video games by its name. Yeah, because the CIA would never have any kind of mind control based experiments or experiments with LSD or anything of that nature. Clearly, they would never do that. Coincidence theorists are a goofy bunch, those that claim that they would never. MK Ultra, of course. I will be doing a dedicated MK Ultra podcast series because there's so much there. A lot of goofs and authority worshipping cultists think that MK Ultra was actually shut down. When MK Ultra CIA operatives involved in MK Ultra, whistleblowers and such, they've gone on public record stating that that was all a farce. The shutdown was just, that was just a propaganda farce, and they continued their operations. And furthermore, what authority-worshipping cultists and coincidence theorists fail to understand, if they were willing to declassify what they declassified regarding MK Ultra, what did they really do? If they were willing to admit that, what would they not be willing to admit? This is just basic psychology, basic corruption awareness, but the gullible goofs who worship authorities and just maintain that conspiracies don't exist and it's all nonsense, they're just not very bright. There's no other way to say that. But continuing on here with the Wikipedia article, the urban legend says that in 1981, when new arcade games were uncommon, an unheard of new arcade game appeared in several suburbs of Portland, Oregon. The game was popular to the point of addiction, with lines forming around the machines and often resulting in fights over who would play next. The machines were visited by men in black who collected unknown data from the machines, allegedly testing the responses to the game's psychoactive effects. Players supposedly suffered from a series of unpleasant side effects, including seizures, amnesia, insomnia, night terrors, and hallucinations. Approximately 1 month after its supposed release in 1981, Polybius is said to have disappeared without a trace. The company named in most accounts of the game is Sinosloschen. The word is described by writer Brian Dunning, a classic coincidence theorist Dunning-Kruger goof, as not quite idiomatic German, a word constructed outside the norms of German language usage and grammar, meaning sense, delete, or sensory deprivation. If it was a German term of actual use, Sinosloschen would be pronounced like Zinosloschen. The word's meaning are derived from the German words Sinn, or sign, senses, and Ioschen, to extinguish or to delete, though the way they are combined is not standard German. The game has the same name as the classical Greek historian Polybius, born in Arcadia. Okay, now before we get into the nitty-gritty with the rest of this Wikipedia article and the exact details and the history of this so-called urban legend, let's get into Polybius, who he was, the background here, and the links to Arcadia. A lot of coincidences here. So Polybius, circa 2000 to circa 118 BC, was a Greek historian of the Hellenistic period. He is noted for his work, The Histories, which covered the period of 264 to 146 BC and the Punic Wars in detail. Polybius is important for his analysis of the mixed constitution or the separation of powers in government. His in-depth discussion of checks and balances to limit power, and his introduction of the people, which influenced Montesquieu's The Spirit of the Laws, John Locke's 2 Treatises of Government, and the framers of the United States Constitution. The leading expert on Polybius for nearly a century was F.W. Walbank, 1909 to 2008, who published studies related to him for 50 years, including a long commentary of his histories and a biography. Early life, Polybius was born around 200 BC in Megalopolis, Arcadia, where he was an active member of the Achaean League. The town was revived along with other Achaean states a century before he was born. Polybius' father, Lycortas, was a prominent landowning politician and member of the governing class who became strategos, commanding general of the Achaean League. Consequently, Polybius was able to observe firsthand during his first 40 years the political and military affairs of Megalopolis, gaining experience as a statesman. In his early years, he accompanied his father while traveling as an ambassador. He developed an interest in horse riding and hunting, diversions that later commended him to his Roman captors. In 182 BC, he was given quite an honor when he was chosen to carry the funeral urn of Philopomen, one of the most eminent Achaean politicians of his generation. In either 169 BC or 170 BC, Polybius was elected hipparchus, the cavalry officer, with the intention of fighting for Rome during the Third Macedonian War. This event often presaged selection to the annual Strategia chief generalship. His early political career was devoted largely towards maintaining the independence of Megalopolis. Personal experiences: Polybius' father, Lycortas, was a prominent advocate of neutrality during the Roman war against Perseus of Macedon. Lycortes attracted the suspicion of the Romans, and Polybius subsequently was one of the 1,000 Achaean nobles who were transported to Rome as hostages in 167 BC, and was detained there for 17 years. In Rome, by virtue of his high culture, Polybius was admitted to the most distinguished houses, in particular to that of Lucius Aemilius Paulus Macedonicus, the conqueror in the Third Macedonian War, who entrusted Polybius with the education of his sons, Fabius and Scipio Aemilianus, who had been adopted by the eldest son of Scipio Africanus. Polybius remained on cordial terms with his former pupil, Scipio Aemilianus, and was among the members of the Scipionic Circle. When Scipio defeated the Carthaginians in the Third Punic War, Polybius remained his counselor. The Achaean hostages were released in 150 BC, and Polybius was granted leave to return home, but the next year he went on campaign with Scipio Aemilianus to Africa and was present at the sack of Carthage in 146, which he later described. Following the destruction of Carthage, Polybius likely journeyed along the Atlantic coast of Africa as well as Spain. After the destruction of Corinth in the same year, Polybius returned to Greece, making use of his Roman connections to lighten the conditions there. Polybius was charged with the difficult task of organizing the new form of government in Greek cities, and in this office he gained great recognition. At Rome, in the succeeding years, Polybius resided in Rome, completing his historical work while occasionally undertaking long journeys through the Mediterranean countries in the furtherance of his history, in particular with the aim of obtaining first-hand knowledge of historical sites. He apparently interviewed veterans to clarify details of the events he was recording, and was similarly given access to archival material. Little is known of Polybius' later life. He most likely accompanied Scipio to Spain, acting as his military advisor during the Numantine War. He later wrote about this war in a lost monograph. Polybius probably returned to Greece later in his life, as evidenced by the many existent inscriptions and statues of him there. The last event mentioned in his histories seemed to be the construction of the Via Domitia in southern France in 118 BC, which suggests the writings of Pseudo-Lucian may have been grounding in fact when they state Polybius fell from his horse while riding up from the country, fell ill as a result, and died at the age of 82. The Histories. The Histories describes the rise of the Roman Republic as a global power in the ancient Mediterranean world. The work includes eyewitness accounts of the sack of Carthage and Corinth, and the Roman annexation of mainland Greece after the Achaean War. Polybius' histories cover the period from 264 BC to 146 BC. It focuses mainly on the years 220 BC to 167 BC, detailing ancient Rome's overcoming of their geopolitical rival, Carthage, and thereby becoming the dominant Mediterranean force. Books 1 through 5 are the history's introductions set during his lifetime. They describe political affairs in the leading Mediterranean states during the time, including ancient Greece and Egypt, explaining their interconnectedness. In Book 6, Polybius describes the political, military, and moral institutions that allowed the Romans to succeed. He also describes the First and Second Punic Wars. Polybius concludes that the Romans are the preeminent power because they have customs and institutions which promote a deep desire for noble acts, a love of virtue, piety towards parents and elders, and a fear of the gods. Polybius also details the battles between Hannibal and Scipio Africanus in the Second Punic War, such as the Battle of Ticinus, the Battle of Trebia, the Siege of Saguntum, the Battle of Libaeum, the Battle of Rhone Crossing, and the Battle of Zama, among others. In Book 7, Polybius discusses the worth of Timaeus' account of the same period of history. He asserts Timaeus' point of view is inaccurate, invalid, and biased in favor of Rome. Christian Habicht considered the criticism of Timaeus to be spiteful and biased. However, Polybius' history is also useful in analyzing the different Hellenistic versions of history and of use as a credible illustration of actual events during the Hellenistic period. Sources. Polybius held that historians should only chronicle events whose participants the historian was able to interview. And you know what's curious here? I'm going to just do a quick commentary. The name of this game is Polybius. So whether hoax or not, because if this is a hoax, determining that exactly and why that name was chosen, or if it's not a hoax and it was real, and we'll be getting into possible Mandela effect and time travel implications in this so-called urban legend, because does that account for some people not remembering the game, some people remembering the game? Or if there really was only 1 or 2 or 3 of these machines ever made, and it wasn't a month, they were only out for a period of 2 or 3 days. I mean, only the hardcore arcade aficionados who go to the arcade every single day would have remembered seeing or playing it. And furthermore, if those people just happened to fall ill and die, who else would remember the game? You would still think anybody that visited the arcade who didn't play the game, I mean, if they're not really paying attention, I guess they wouldn't necessarily notice the game in the background if they were constantly getting new games in, but who knows? But if Polybius's methodology here So his beliefs are that historians should only chronicle events whose participants the historian was able to interview, and was among the first to champion the notion of factual integrity in historical writing. In the 12th volume of the Histories, Polybius defines the historian's job as the analysis of documentation, the review of relevant geographical information, and political experience. In Polybius's time, the profession of a historian required political experience, which aided in the differentiating between fact and fiction, and familiarity with the geography surrounding one's subject matter to supply an accurate version of events. Polybius himself exemplified these principles as he was well-traveled and possessed political and military experience. He did not neglect written sources that provided essential material for his histories of the period from 264 BC to 220 BC. When addressing events after 220, he examined the writings of Greek and Roman historians to acquire credible sources of information, but rarely did he name those sources. As historian, Polybius wrote several works, most of which are lost. Is that another interesting parallel there? His earliest work was a biography of the Greek statesman Philopomen. This work was later used as a source by Plutarch when composing his Parallel Lives. However, the original Polybian text is lost. In addition, Polybius wrote an extensive treatise called Tactics, which may have detailed Roman and Greek military tactics. Small parts, also I'm going to chime in here regarding the arcade game Battlezone, which came out earlier in 1981 coincidentally, and was later, Atari was actually contacted by the Defense Department, the US government, to develop training programs for tank commanders or tank operatives based on the game Battlezone. And then, so this is within a few months of Battlezone that Polybius is allegedly released. And of course, Polybius, not just a historian detailing methodology of verification of history, but also a military tactician. I mean, what does this all mean? Small parts of his work may survive in his major histories, but the work itself is lost as well. Another missing work was a historical monograph on the events of the Numantine War. The largest Polybian work was, of course, his histories, of which only the first 5 books survive entirely intact, along with a large portion of the 6th book and fragments of the rest. Along with Cato the Elder, he can be considered one of the founding fathers of Roman historiography. Polybius was among the first historians to attempt to present history as a sequence of causes and effects based upon a careful examination and criticism of tradition. He narrated his history based on first-hand knowledge. The histories captured the varied elements of the story of human behavior: nationalism, xenophobia, duplicitous politics, war, brutality, loyalty, valor, intelligence, reason, and resourcefulness. And are these things that, if this arcade game was real, was measuring these things? Aside from the narrative of the historical events, Polybius also included 3 books of digressions. Book 34 was entirely devoted to questions of geography and included some trenchant criticism of Eratosthenes, whom he accused of passing on popular preconceptions, or lau dogmatica. Book 12 was a disquisition on the writing of history, citing extensive passages of lost historians, such as Callisthenes and Theopompus. Most influential was Book 6, which describes Roman political, military, and moral institutions, which he considered keys to Rome's success. It presented Rome as having a mixed constitution in which monarchical, aristocratic, and popular elements existed in stable equilibrium. This enabled Rome to escape, for the time being, the cycle of eternal revolutions, anacyclosis. While Polybius was not the first to advance this view, his account provided the most cogent illustration of the ideal for later political theorists. A key theme of the histories is the good statesman as virtuous and composed. The character of Polybian statesman is exemplified in that of Philip II. His beliefs about Philip's character led Polybius to reject historian Theopompus's description of Philip's private drunken debauchery. For Polybius, it was inconceivable that such an able and effective statesman could have an immoral and unrestrained private life as described by Theopompus. In recounting the Roman Republic, Polybius stated that, quote, "The Senate stands in awe of the multitude and cannot neglect the feelings of the people," end quote. Other important themes running through the histories are the role of fortune in the affairs of nations, his insistence that history should be demonstratory or apodectic, providing lessons for statesmen, and that historians should be men of action, pragmatikoi. Polybius is considered by some to be the successor of Thucydides in terms of objectivity and critical reasoning, and the forefather of scholarly, painstaking historical research in the modern scientific sense. According to this view, his work sets forth the course of history's occurrences with clearness, penetration, sound judgment, and among the circumstances affecting the outcomes, he lays special emphasis on geographical conditions. Modern historians are especially impressed with the manner in which Polybius used his sources, particularly documentary evidence, as well as his citation and quotation of sources. Furthermore, there is some admiration of Polybius's meditation on the nature of historiography in Book 12. His works belongs, therefore, amongst the greatest productions of ancient historical writing. The writer of the Oxford Companion to Classical Literature in 1937 praises him for his earnest devotion to truth and his systemic pursuit of causation. So it's interesting, this urban legend about a game which might not have existed regarding a guy named after a guy with an earnest devotion to truth. It has long been acknowledged that Polybius's writings are prone to a certain hagiographic tone when writing of his friends, such as Scipio, and subject to vindictive tone when dealing with the exploits of his enemies, such as Callicrates, the Achaean statesman responsible for this Roman exile. As a hostage in Rome, then as a client to the Scipios, and after 146 BC, a collaborator with Roman rule, Polybius was probably in no position to freely express any negative opinions of Rome. Peter Green advises that Polybius was chronicling Roman history for a Greek audience to justify what he believed to be the inevitability of Roman rule. Nevertheless, Green considers Polybius's histories as the best source for the era that they cover. For Ronald Mellor, Polybius was a loyal partisan of Scipio, intent on vilifying his patron's opponents. Adrian Goldsworthy, while using Polybius as a source for Scipio's generalship, notes Polybius's underlying and overt bias in Scipio's favor. H. Ormerod considers that Polybius cannot be regarded as an altogether unprejudiced witness in relation to his betes noires, the Aetolians, the Carthaginians, and the Cretans. Other historians perceive considerably negative bias in Polybius' account of Crete. On the other hand, Hansen notes that the same work, along with passages from Strabo and Scylax, provide a reliable guide in the eventual rediscovery of the lost city of Kydonia. So there's a common theme running through here, also a lot of lost works. A lot that is lost, a lost city. I mean, there's a lot here. Also interesting regarding cryptography, Polybius was responsible for a useful tool in telegraphy that allowed letters to be easily signaled using a numerical system called the Polybius square. This idea also lends itself to cryptographic manipulation and steganography. Modern implementations of the Polybius square, at least in Western European languages such as English, Spanish, French, German, and Italian, generally use the Roman alphabet in those languages as written. However, Polybius himself was writing in Greek and would have implemented his cipher square in the Greek alphabet. Both versions are shown here. So now we have ciphers. Cryptography, clearly areas of CIA interest. In the Polybius square, letters of the alphabet were arranged left to right, top to bottom in a 5 by 5 square. When used within the 26-letter Latin alphabet, two letters, usually I and J, are combined. When used with the Greek alphabet, which has exactly one less letter than there are spaces, or code points, in the square, the final 5-5 code point encodes the spaces in between words. Alternatively, it can denote the end of a sentence or paragraph when writing in a continuous script. 5 numbers are then aligned on the outside top of the square, and 5 numbers on the left side of the square vertically. Usually these numbers were arranged 1 through 5. By cross-referencing the two numbers along the grid of the square, a letter can be deduced. In the histories, Polybius specifies how this cipher could be used in fire signals, where long-range messages could be sent by means of torches raised and lowered to signify the column and row of each letter. This was a great leap forward from previous fire signaling, which could send prearranged codes only, such as, if we light the fire, it means the enemy has arrived. Other writings of scientific interest include detailed discussions of the machines Archimedes created for the defense of Syracuse against the Romans, where Polybius praised the old man and his engineering in the highest terms, and an analysis of the usefulness of anatomy to generals, both in the histories. Now, regarding Arcadia, which I haven't heard a lot of people talk about this, Polybius was chosen as the name of this game, and this guy happens to be from Arcadia. This is an arcade game in arcades. It is also home of the god Pan. Also in 2008, classicist Christos Mergopis suggested that the mummified remains of Alexander the Great, but not his actual tomb, may in fact be located in Gortnia, Arcadia, in the Peloponnese of Greece. Since 2008, research is ongoing. Interesting. Now, regarding the Polybius square, the Polybius square, also known as the Polybius checkerboard, is a device invented by the ancient Greeks Cleoxenus and Democritus, and made famous by the historian and scholar Polybius. So, of course, checkerboards, popular in Freemasonry depictions and Freemasonry symbology and rituals. Is there a connection here? Is there an Illuminati connection? Like many believe the CIA are connected to all of that. The device is used for fractionating plain text characters so that they can be represented by a smaller set of symbols, which is useful for telegraphy, steganography, and cryptography. The device was originally used for fire signaling, allowing the coded transmission of any message, not just a finite amount of predetermined options, as was the convention before. Basic form. According to Polybius' histories, the device was invented by Cleoxenus and Democritus and further developed by Polybius himself. The device partitioned the alphabet into 5 tablets with 5 letters each, except for the last one with only 4. There are no surviving tablets from antiquity. I mean, is that just another parallel here? There are no surviving tablets. Are there no surviving Polybius arcade machines? Letters are represented by 2 numbers from 1 to 5, allowing the representation of 25 characters using only 5 numeric symbols. The original square used the Greek alphabet laid out as follows. With the modern Latin alphabet, this is the typical form. Each letter is then represented by its coordinates in the grid. For example, BAT becomes 12, 11, 44. The 26 letters of the Latin-English alphabet do not fit in a 5 by 5 square. 2 letters must be combined, usually I and J as above, although C and K as an alternative. Alternatively, a 6 by 6 grid may be used to allow numerals or special characters to be included as well as letters. A 6 by 6 grid is also usually used for the Cyrillic alphabet. The most common variant has 33 letters. 33, Freemasonry. But some have up to 37, or Japanese hiragana. A key could also be used to reorder the alphabet in the square, with the letters without duplicates of the key being placed at the beginning and the remaining letters following it in alphabetical order. For example, the key phrase Polybius cipher would lead to the reordered square below. Applications. Telegraphy. In his histories, Polybius outlined the need for effective signaling in warfare, leading to the development of the square. The Polybius square has also been used in the form of the knock code to signal messages between cells in prisons by tapping the numbers on pipes or walls. It is said to have been used by the nihilist prisoners of the Russian Tsars, and also by U.S. prisoners of war during the Vietnam War. Arthur Koestler describes the code being used by political prisoners of Stalin in the 30s in his anti-totalitarian novel Darkness at Noon. Koestler had been a prisoner of war during the Spanish Civil War. Indeed, it can be signaled in many simple ways: flashing lamps, blasts of sound, drums, smoke signals, and is much easier to learn than the more sophisticated codes like the Morse code. However, it is also somewhat less efficient than more complex codes. In stenography, the simple representation also lends itself to steganography. The figures from 1 to 5 can be indicated by knots in a string, stitches on a quilt, contiguous letters before a wider space, or many other ways. In cryptography, the Polybius square is also used as a basic cipher, called the Polybius cipher. The cipher is quite insecure by modern standards, as it is a substitution cipher, with characters being substituted for pairs of digits, which is easily broken through frequency analysis. Adaptation. The Polybius square and the Polybius cipher can be combined with other cryptographic methods such as the ADFGVX cipher, the homophonic cipher, and more. The hybrid Polybius Playfair cipher. Play fair in an arcade for playing games. The Playfair cipher is a polyalphabetic substitution cipher invented by Charles Wheatstone and promoted by Lyon Playfair, based on a 5x5 square which accommodates the alphabet in a manner similar to the Polybius square. The letters in the square are arranged by first inserting the letters of a key without repetition before the remaining letters, which appear subsequently in normal alphabetical order. A message is divided into pairs of letters with a filler letter X inserted at the end of the message if the message was of odd length. If both letters of a pair are the same, a filler X is inserted between them with an extra X inserted at the end of the message to compensate for this. Each pair of letters are then encrypted using the Playfair key table through mapping rules. The mapping rules are: 1. If the letters of the pair appear in the same row of the table, replace them with the letters to their immediate right, respectively. If a letter of the plaintext pair is the rightmost letter in the row, wrap around to the left side of the row. 2. If the letters of the pair appear in the same column of the table, replace them with the letters immediately below, respectively. If a letter in the plaintext pair is on the bottom of the column, wrap around to the top of the column. 3. If the letters of the pair are not on the same row or column, replace them with the letters in the same row of the letter and on the column of the other letter of the pair. The order here is important. The first letter of the encrypted pair is the one that sits in the same row as the first letter and on the column of the second letter of the plain text pair. So here's a table for a Playfair cipher using the key Playfair. The decryption rules are the same as the encryption. The cipher message is mapped with the same Playfair matrix for decryption and gives the plain text message back. For a hybrid Polybius Playfair cipher, a new and bigger table is used, with messages being encrypted and decrypted twice. The plain text is encrypted using the Playfair cipher first, then using the Polybius cipher. Very, very interesting indeed here. So we have a game with the name Polybius, with implications that this historian from Arcadia, who also developed or at least had ciphers used. And Lyon Playfair was actually a British scientist and a Liberal politician who was Postmaster General from 1873 to 1874. But let's continue on here with what we're here for, Polybius. So now that we have the background information on the Greek historian and the ciphers, let's continue here. The origins. Due to the viral and anecdotal nature of the legend, an exact origin is unclear. Some anecdotal accounts claim the legend originated on Usenet, circa 1994, or earlier through offline word of mouth. I'm still maintaining we need to get some nerds that were around back in the BBS days in the mid-late 80s, early 90s. There might be something there if this is real. Or even if it's not real, the origins of the legend might be buried there. I have not been able to find a full archive account of the BBS boards. The earliest confirmed record of the legend is an entry for the title added to arcade game resource coinop.org on February 6th, 2000. Although coinop.org lists the page as originating in 1998, journalist Stuart Brown states that it appears to have defaulted to that time due to a database error caused by a lack of input. The entry mentions the name Polybius and a copyright date of 1981. The author of the entry claims in the description to be in possession of a ROM image of the game and to have extracted fragments of text from it, including 1981 Sinnosloshen. The remainder of the information about the game is listed as unknown, and its About the Game section describes the bizarre rumors that make up the legend. So the entry here under game details says this game had a very limited release, 1 or 2 backwater arcades in a suburb of Portland. The history of this game is cloudy. There were all kinds of strange stories about how kids who played it got amnesia afterwards, couldn't remember their name or where they lived, etc. The bizarre rumors about this game are that it was supposedly developed by some kind of weird military tech offshoot group, used some kind of proprietary behavior modification algorithms developed for the CIA or something. Kids who played it woke up at night screaming, having horrible nightmares. According to an operator who ran an arcade with one of these games, guys in black coats would come to collect records from the machines. They're not interested in quarters or anything, they just collected information about how the game was played. The game was weird looking, kind of abstract, fast action with some puzzle elements. The kids who played it stopped playing games entirely. One of them became a big anti-video game crusader or something. We've contacted one person who met him, and he claims the machines disappeared after a month or so, and no one ever heard about them again. Until the ROM showed up. Here's what we've found so far. Found English strings insert coin and press 1 player start and only. Looks like a 1 or 2 player game. Text in the game says copyright 1981 Sinnosloshen, maybe a German company. If anyone has heard any additional information about this game, we'd appreciate hearing about it. Quick update. We just wanted to go on record here that Stephen Roach is full of himself and knows nothing about this game. We have it on good authority. No, Polybius is not a Tempest prototype. No, Polybius is not a vector game. Does the title screen look vector? No, it does not. We've recently received some new information about the game. Today is May 16th, 2009. And yes, one of us is flying to the Kiev, Ukraine area tomorrow. And yes, the trip is related to this information. Stay tuned. So, okay, now we have some kind of German company base. Obviously, the Germans involved in the occult. Possible Illuminati connections. Now we have the connections to the Ukraine in this update from 2009. So originally posted in February 6, 2000, and then was the first update 2009? Huh. But there's another section here. Sometime prior to September 2003, Kurt Kohler, is that a German name? Owner of coinop.org, submitted a message to the American video game magazine Game Pro about Polybius. Polybius then appeared in the September 2003 issue of Game Pro as part of a feature story on video games called Secrets and Lies. This is the first known printed message of the game, exposing the legend to a mass market audience. The article declared the existence of the game to be inconclusive, helping to both spark curiosity and spread the story. Following the appearance in GamePro magazine, several people claimed to have some involvement with Polybius. In 2006, a man named Stephen Roach claimed he had been one of its original programmers and that his company developed a game with very intense and cutting-edge graphics. However, according to Roach, a boy experienced an epileptic seizure while playing, and the cabinets were withdrawn by the company in a panic. Although Roach offered no proof for his claims, his story added details on gameplay that later inspired Rogue Synapse's game based on the legend. So on GamePro, the write-up here, the government made an arcade game that erased kids' memories and gave them horrific nightmares. Using games for military training is one thing. Using games for mind control, well, that's something else. But there is a cryptic tale of an arcade game called Polybius that appeared in only a handful of locations in Portland, Oregon in the early 1980s. Credited to a company called Sinosloschen, Polybius, named for a Greek historian who also dabbled in cryptography, was an abstract puzzle game that reportedly caused nightmares and memory loss in those who played it. Sinneslaschen is German for sense deleting. And some supposedly swore off games for good. And to seal the deal, one arcade owner claimed that black-coated gentlemen would periodically come to collect data, but not for coins from the machines. And again, I don't believe anybody's ever come forward claiming to be this arcade owner. Although, again, if this was true and they were intimidated after the fact, obviously they wouldn't. Unfortunately, the main thing that's missing is proof. While a ROM reportedly exists, it hasn't actually been located. A title screen is all anyone seems able to produce, and these are easy to create in Photoshop. The company's name font is the same one Williams used on several of its games, making cut and paste easy for an aspiring prankster. Also, nobody seems to be willing to name names or authenticate any of the tales floating around the internet. Nothing can be verified by a reliable source, but still, what if it's true? And this is rated inconclusive. So, here's the thing though, if it were real, and they wanted the tracks covered up, obviously none of this would come forward, and it'd be difficult to name names unless it was some kind of whistleblower. And if this was an extremely limited run, if this thing was only out not for a month, as some people claimed, what if it was only out for 3 or 4 days? Would there be enough whistleblowers out there? Now, if it really was out for a month in, let's say, 3 or 4 or 5 locations, obviously that would increase the likelihood of a whistleblower coming forward. Continuing on here with an analysis, the alleged original Polybius arcade game does not exist. Again, this is Wikipedia. This is the official narrative. Snopes.com. A classic powers that be website that pretends to debunk things damaging to the establishment, which catalogs urban legends, concludes the game is a modern-day version of the 1980s rumors of Men in Black. And, of course, the Men in Black government operatives, there's quite a bit there in terms of both verified and unverified reports. If you haven't checked out the MINDSHOCK series on the Men in Black, check that out. This led to the hypothesis that the government was hosting some sort of experiment and sending subliminal messages to the players. Magazines and mainstream news of the early 80s make no mention of Polybius. Well, why would they? Why would this be mainstream if it's some kind of top secret experiment? Aside the mock-up cabinets and games inspired by the myth, no authentic cabinets or ROM dumps have ever been documented. Ben Silverman of Yahoo Games remarked, quote, "Unfortunately, there is no evidence that the game ever existed, no less turned its users into babbling lunatics. Still, Polybius has enjoyed cult-like status as a throwback to a more technologically paranoid era," end quote. Skeptics and researchers have differing ideas on how and why the story of Polybius originated. American producer and author Brian Dunning-Kruger believes Polybius to be an urban legend that grew out of a mixture of influences in the 80s. He notes that 2 players fell in Portland on the same day in 1981, one collapsing with a migraine headache after playing Tempest, and another suffering from stomach pain after playing Asteroids for 28 hours in a filmed attempt to break a world record at the same arcade. I'm also going to add this here. If obviously there weren't cameras to the extent that we have now, but there were some cameras, and if they were filming these people getting sick and they were playing these tournaments, arcade tournaments, is it possible that Polybius could be captured somewhere in the distant background if there's any home video footage of these arcades? Now again, if this machine was specifically released in a backwoods arcade or whatever they referenced it to, and not one of the super popular arcades, perhaps no one would have been filming in 1981 there. Dunning records that the Federal Bureau of Investigation raided several video arcades in the area just 10 days later, where the owners were suspected of using the machines for gambling, and the lead up to the raid involved FBI agents monitoring arcade cabinets for signs of tampering and recording high scores. Dunning suggests that these two events were combined in an urban legend about government-monitored arcade machines making players ill. He believes that such a myth must have been established by 1984 and that it influenced the plot of the film The Last Starfighter, in which a teenager is recruited by aliens who monitor him playing a covertly developed arcade game. Dunning considers Sinauslöschen to be the kind of name that a non-German speaker would generate if they tried to create a compound word using an English to German dictionary. Now, Brian Dunning, I mean, he's a clueless goof, but this is one of his better theories, because this is relatively plausible, that there are kids getting sick from playing arcade games, and there are supposed men in black or possible FBI agents in suits looking mysterious monitoring arcade areas. So if the two got conflated, on the other hand, if this is going on, would the CIA use that to its advantage? Because if this is real, wouldn't it be more convenient for the CIA to insert some of these machines where all this FBI activity and kids getting sick, that's already going on, so their machine would be blended in, and then later after the fact that all these goofs like Brian Dunning, they could just write it off because they have plausible deniability built in with these FBI raids and such, and kids getting sick from playing other games. So that kind of works in either way. Again, if you're not a Dunning-Kruger goof, if you don't fall for logical fallacies, if you have some kind of semblance of critical thinking ability, clearly Brian Dunning doesn't, but if you do, you could see that if this were true, and I'm not claiming it is, again, this is MINDSHOCK here, I'm not claiming anything is true or untrue. The motto here is, the only thing we know for sure is that we don't know anything for sure. But yes, it would be convenient for the CIA to have plausible deniability and a cover story, and who better than the FBI to brush that off on. Internet writer Patrick Kellogg believes that players claiming to remember having played or seen Polybius as early as the 1980s may have been actually recalling the video game Cube Quest. Cube Quest, released in arcade games in 1983, is a shooting game which played from a laserdisc. Kellogg describes its visuals as revolutionary and far ahead of typical games of the time. He states that the game would be frequently visited for maintenance because of frequent breakdowns of laserdisc players in arcade games, and was often removed from arcades after a short time for the same reason. I mean, this is actually relatively plausible. A lot of conspiracies we cover on MINDSHOCK, I mean, the Dunning-Kruger goofs and the coincidence theories, they go through all these mental gymnastics to write off any type of conspiracy. But here, these are actually plausible explanations. Because, again, they're not claiming that people are hallucinating the frequent removal of machines or men in black, people in suits, because why would people be lying about that? But that all these things got mixed up, and that's where the urban legend came from. Again, their coincidences could be real, so Cube Quest might have nothing to do with any of this, and the CIA might have been doing some kind of MKUltra experiment using the FBI stings as plausible deniability cover. Or it might not be real, and all of these things explain it away, some kind of conflation and confusion. I still find it strange. I mean, I would still like to see some kind of reference to any of this, even without Polybius, just to see if people were talking about these kids getting sick and the FBI raids on BBS boards on the early versions of the internet. So I've never actually played Cube Quest, but yeah, I mean, there could be some merit here. The game does have some similarities to the alleged gameplay of Polybius that has been released. I mean, it also, yeah, it does have a certain psychedelic nature. Some people say it was quite ahead of its time. Supposedly it was released in 1983. December 83 in North America. It was the first arcade game to use real-time 3D graphics. Huh, interesting. Very, very interesting. And again, even if it was breaking down all the time, so technicians had to constantly come in and possibly remove them, I mean, that might explain a few things. I mean, this is one of the most plausible scenarios if it's not real, just some kind of conflation of all these things. British filmmaker and video game journalist Stuart Brown concludes that the Polybius legend began no earlier than 2000, arguing against the purported 1980s origin for the myth. In his review of the legend's history, Brown states his conclusion that the Polybius story began as an intentional hoax in 2000 by Kurt Kohler, owner of coinopt.org, in order to drive traffic to his site. Brown states that he did not find any evidence of the Polybius myth existing until the year 2000. The same year, Brown concludes, marked the first appearance of the Polybius article on Kohler's website. In Brown's view, the frequently cited 1980s origin of the myth was an invented aspect written into the coinopt.org description of the legend to make Kohler's hoax more convincing. Brown further theorized that people recalling discussion of Polybius on Usenet in 1994 were misremembering articles on the Pink Floyd-related Publius Enigma puzzle. Per Brown, the Polybius hoax capitalized on the popularity of the conspiracy theories and the highly viral nature of other internet hoaxes in or just before the year 2000. And of course, the Publius Enigma puzzle, that's a curious one. And of course, Pink Floyd, linked to LSD, psychedelics, all these things. CIA, obviously involved in MKUltra, LSD type experiments. So for one to be true, now regarding Publius Enigma, it was true in the sense that there was that message displayed at there was discussion on Usenet in 94, and the Publius Enigma message was displayed at a Pink Floyd concert, although nothing more was ever made from it. So technically it was real enough to be displayed at the I mean, what does everybody make of that? Because it's tough to reconcile all of these things. Let's not fall for black and white logical fallacies. Obviously that doesn't mean that Polybius is real just because the Publius Enigma happened to be real to the extent that it was officially shown at their show. It probably deserves its own episode, but I'm just going to do a quick recap here from the wiki. The Publius Enigma is an internet phenomenon and an unsolved problem that began with the cryptic messages posted by a user identifying only as Publius to the unmoderated Usenet news group alt.music.pink-floyd through the Pennet Remailer, a now defunct anonymous information exchange service. The messenger proposed a riddle in connection with the 1994 Pink Floyd album The Division Bell, promising that the answer would lead to a reward. Guitarist David Gilmour denied any involvement, while album artist Storm Thorgerson was bemused. According to drummer Nick Mason, EMI Records were responsible. It remains unclear if the enigma involves a genuinely solvable puzzle as part of an early internet-based context, or was a convoluted hoax. You know, the other thing that's kind of weird, though, if you're Kohler, looking to create some kind of hoax, would you use a name so close to a previous one in 94? Would you use Polybius if this was previously Publius, the Publius Enigma? Or would you choose a completely new name so nobody would draw parallels to it? I mean, that's a question there. That's a question. History: during the 94 Division Bell World Tour, Columbia Records flew a 194-foot-long airship named the Division Bell between Pink Floyd concert locations. I mean, that's dedication. I don't know when was the last time a record label did that. The Columbia Electric press kit was released to the media along with the promo spots video consisting of interviews with band members, footage of the airship in action, and a segment which contained the following quote. A spokesperson for Pink Floyd has issued the following statement. You have spotted the Pink Floyd airship. Do not be alarmed. Pink Floyd have sent their airship to North America to deliver a message. The Pink Floyd airship is headed towards a destination where all will be explained upon arrival. Pink Floyd will communicate. End quote. On June 11th, 1994, a user of the anonymous Pennant Remailer service posted the following message to the Usenet news group alt.music.pink-floyd. The message. My friends, you have heard the message Pink Floyd has delivered, but have you listened? Perhaps I can be your guide, but I will not solve the enigma for you. All of you must open your minds and communicate with each other, as this is the only way the answers can be revealed. I may help you, but only if obstacles arise. Listen, read, think, communicate. If I don't promise you the answers, would you go? Publius. A follow-up clarified the challenge. As some of you have suspected, the division bell is not like its predecessors. Although all great music is subject to multiple interpretations, in this case there's a central purpose and a design solution. For the ingenious person or group of persons who recognizes this and where this information points to, a unique prize has been secreted. How and where? The division bell. Listen again. Look again, as your thoughts will steer you. Leading the blind while I stare out the steel in your eyes. Lyrics, artwork, and music will take you there. In order to refute the ensuing skepticism, Publius agreed to provide proof of his authenticity. On July 16, 1994, he delivered a prediction. To validate the trust of those who believe, as well as to reconcile the doubt of others, I have gone to great lengths to plan the following display of communication. Monday, July 18th, East Rutherford, New Jersey, approximately 10:30 p.m. Flashing white lights. There is an enigma. Trust. On the night of July 18th, so this is only 2 days later, July 94, patterns in the lights on the front of the stage at the Pink Floyd concert in East Rutherford momentarily spelled out the words Enigma Publius. How surprised were all those people on the Usenet who just thought it was all a hoax to see that? In September 96, the Pennant Remailer service was shut down by its creator over legal threats posed to the guaranteed anonymity of its users. As a consequence, contact to the newsgroup through the associated Publius account ceased. Subsequent Publius-style posts from other addresses have led to differing opinions over the status of the enigma and whether or not it has ever been solved. Official statements. During a 2002 web chat, guitarist Dave Gilmour said the puzzle was, quote, some silly record company thing that they thought up to puzzle people with, end quote. I mean, it's so random, though, because if it's not solvable, why would they do that? And then expend the energy to actually flash the Enigma Publius at the concert. As a consequence, contact to the news group... Okay. In April 2005, during a book signing of his biographical work Inside Out, A Personal History of Pink Floyd, drummer Nick Mason affirmed that it had been instigated by the record company. Quote, that was a ploy done by EMI. They had a man working for them who adored puzzles. He used to work for the Reagan administration. Okay, so we have political government ties here. His job would be in meetings with the president, and when Reagan would say, let's bomb these people, he would say, that's not a good idea, sir. He was working for EMI and suggested that a puzzle be created that could be followed on the web. The prize was never given out. To this day, it remains unresolved. The prize was something like a crop of trees planted in a clear-cut area of forest or something to that effect. It was not to be a prize of some tangible thing, but rather a touchy-feely sort of gift that was more of a philanthropic thing than something you could hang on the wall. What's curious, though, a crop of trees in the forest. So Pan, is the god of nature, the wild, mountain wilds. From Arcadia. Publius was also used by Alexander Hamilton as a pseudonym. Publius means the people or of the people. So is this all the work of some guy who used to work for the Reagan administration? The comments made by Mason corroborate parts of a previous interview by Sean Heisler with Mark Brickman, Pink Floyd's lighting and production designer, and the man apparently responsible for putting the Enigma Publius message in the lights at the New Jersey concert. I think it really came out of some guy in Washington, D.C. that used to be with the CIA or the FBI or something that was in the encryption game. He decided he wanted to do some kind of album cover, and he started talking to Steve O'Rourke, and I think what happened was Steve O'Rourke had in his brilliant mind that he was going to try something on the internet because he had been listening to me. And he got this guy because if you notice, a lot of this stuff can't be traced where it comes from. And I know that Dave, for one thing, didn't even know how to sign on. Douglas Adams, who was credited with giving the album its title, categorically denied any knowledge or involvement and dismissed the idea of the band members being responsible. Quote, "What I said was that I myself knew nothing about it and had never heard Dave or Nick mention it, and that it didn't sound like anything to be bothered with. But I'm speaking from experience rather than specific knowledge. Everybody who writes, whether it's novels or songs or anything at all that happens in the public eye, knows that there are always a million theories about whether you meant V, W, X, Y, or Z when you said A, B, or C. The only thing I know of that was added to a Floyd concert recently was a message flashed up on a screen from Dave's daughter, Claire, wishing Dave and Polly a happy wedding. That's an actual thing to do with actual people. You have to remember that rock musicians, however talented, are just a bunch of human beings playing guitars, like novelists are just a bunch of people who stare blearily at a word processor in the morning and maybe try to think of something that's a bit funny without being embarrassingly stupid. All this secret message stuff is just blah. As far as this Publius thing is concerned, I don't know anything for sure. All I can say is it sounds like nothing at all the band would do. They're doing a serious job making sure the tour goes well, and sounds everything like something with a fan with too much time on his hands would dream up, end quote. What's weird, though, is so this guy's pretending or either genuinely doesn't know that the message was flashed at the concert, because he's saying the only message he knows about was about a wedding. Uncle Custard, the Pink Floyd magazine Brain Damage, had a Q&A section reserved for a correspondent known only as Uncle Custard. The name, phonetically similar to Uncool Car Stud, was created by Glenn Povey, apparently an allusion to Nick Mason's passion for auto racing. Issue number 34 of the magazine contains the following. Question: who is Publius Enigma? What is the meaning of it all? And what is the treasure to be had? Answer by Uncle Custard. As the infamous Q has emphasized, you humans are so limited. This is a project for all those out there with higher IQs. It does require a mastery of diverse languages along with a lot of spare time. Now get with it. The lights were brighter. The meaning is worn inside out. The bell has tolled, and the surrogate band is coming back to life. The answer lies non-linearly with the paradox of the theme of the division bell. Communication breakdown. Hint, watch the Learning to Fly video. It may also involve an anomaly in the time-space continuum. There is an obvious solution, and you do not need to be a Floyd historian to figure it out. Winners will receive official entry into the Mensa Society and some dry ice to cool down all those neural pathways in your brain. It is important to note that neither I nor anyone involved with this Zine will enter into any correspondence on this topic. It's a puzzle for you, devised by the one who loves you enough to drive you mad. Besides, I'm much too busy creating crop circles and executing think tank projects for the Pentagon. End quote there. Although the answers given by Uncle Custard over the years have all been written by several different people affiliated with the magazine, this particular response has been attributed to former editor and final publisher of the printed version of Brain Damage, Jeff Jensen. The accuracy of the content of this answer and under what authority, if any, Jensen had to produce it remains unclear. Very, very interesting. Now, apparently there's even more Easter eggs here. It wasn't just the one concert in Jersey in July 94. Pulse, a DVD of the October 20th, 94 televised concert at Earl's Court, London, contains footage of the word enigma being projected in large letters onto the backdrop of the stage during the song Another Brick in the Wall Part 2. The DVD's authoring company, Das Boot, uses an Enigma machine as their logo, which can be seen at the end of the show. Okay, I mean, this is getting really crazy. An Enigma machine is a cipher device developed and used in the early to mid 20th century to protect commercial, diplomatic, military communication. It was employed extensively by Nazi Germany during World War II in all branches of the German military. The Enigma machine was considered so secure that it was used to encipher the most top secret messages. And you know what's weird, though? With all this talk of ciphers, Publius Enigma, the Enigma machine, and then also Polybius and the Polybius ciphers. Again, if this is all a hoax just drawing upon this, I mean, this would be somebody with some good knowledge of Pink Floyd. Is there any evidence that Kohler is a Pink Floyd fan and would know all of this? In the 2019 re-edit of Pulse included in the Later Years box set, different camera angles are substituted so that the Enigma projection is less prominent. You can still see the MA in one shot and the bottom IGMA in another, but the prominent wide shot, which clearly said Enigma, appears to have been deliberately removed. Very interesting here. And so with Polybius and the his opinions and beliefs regarding history, verifying history, etc., and then the erasing of history here regarding the Publius Enigma, I mean, that's curious. In the artwork for the mini-disc release of A Momentary Lapse of Reason, the word Publius has been inserted into the photo of the man in the rye field. The word Enigma appears in the lower corner of the picture of the man standing on the edge of the cliff. What? The words Publius Enigma are spoken just before the song One of These Days on the 2003 DVD release of Pink Floyd Live at Pompeii. Interesting connection to Rome there. So in 2019, they're trying to erase all of this, but through the 90s and early 2000s, it was still present. Storm Thorgerson's cover for John Harris's book, The Dark Side of the Moon, The Making of the Pink Floyd Masterpiece, includes the following text. Quote, despite numerous attempts to elucidate the mysteries of its success, the ubiquitous popularity of this record remains an enigma. End quote. The official Pink Floyd biography contains the statement, quote, true to their beginnings, there has always been an enigma at their heart. And ends with, for at the heart of Pink Floyd, there has always been an enigma. The Ian Eames movie, The Endless River, 2019, that can be found in the Later Years box, shows the words Publius Enigma at the end of the second Alan's Y song. Wow. Okay, so that was a little bit longer aside than I wanted, but clearly there's a basis and a foundation of mixing some kind of facts here. But let's continue with the Polybius wiki entry here. Brown also notes striking similarities between the fonts used on the supposed title screen provided by the image on coinop.org in 2000 and those used for two Williams Electronics arcade video games, Bubbles and Robotron 2084. He concludes that the 5-pixel text used for the credit counter is similar to that of Robotron 2084, and that the font that reads Sinoslashen is almost identical to that of Bubbles, with the only difference is the appearance of the O and the mirror image reversal of the H along a central vertical axis. Brown states that this could be the work of a copycat fan of Williams Electronics. Both Bubbles and Robotron 2084 were made by Williams, and both were released only a year later than when Polybius was said to first appear. Polybius for Windows 2007. In 2007, freeware developers and arcade constructors Rogue Synapse registered the domain name sinoslashen.com and offered a free downloadable game titled Polybius for Microsoft Windows. The game's design is partly based on a contested description of the Polybius arcade machine posted on a forum by an individual named Stephen Roach, who claimed to have worked on the original. Rogue Synapse's Polybius is a 2D shooter resembling Star Castle. To complete the illusion, Rogue Synapse's owner, Dr. Estill Vance, founded a Texas-based corporation bearing the name Sinoslashen in 2007. He transferred it to the Rogue Synapse trademark and a newly registered trademark on Polybius. Its website says that it is an attempt to recreate the Polybius game as it might have existed in 1981. Polybius for PlayStation 4 2017. In 2016, Llamasoft announced a game called Polybius for PlayStation 4 with support for the PlayStation VR, released on the PlayStation Store Tuesday, May 9, 2017. In early marketing, co-author Jeff Minter claimed to have been permitted to play the original Polybius arcade machine in a warehouse in Basingstoke, England. He later acknowledged the game was inspired by the urban legend, but does not attempt to reproduce its alleged gameplay. The video for the 2017 Nine Inch Nails song Less Than features visuals from Polybius. In pop culture, Polybius is featured in the episode Journey into Mystery of the 2021 Disney Plus series Loki, which is set in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Also in the first episode of Paper Girls 2022, Polybius runs on a home game console. It's also featured in the background of a Simpsons episode. Another interesting wrinkle here is that there was another arcade game, Poly Play, although it was further along in 1985, that was actually recalled. Now, Polybius, Poly Play, and then mixing that with Cube Quest, the FBI raids, the kids getting sick earlier. Is this all just jumbled together? And does it all explain everything away? Or is there some kind of Mandela effect involved here? So let's go on to an article here by Inverse.com. One of the best articles I've found here by Ryan Houlihan. Urban legend Polybius is real. Video game's most notorious urban legend turns out to have been all too true. In 1981, an arcade in the Portland, Oregon area was the scene of countless gamers coming down with migraines, heart attacks, addictions, seizures, strokes, and even amnesia, all due to one game cabinet, Polybius. The game itself was said to have been created by an unknown government agency to test mind control technology on unsuspecting civilians. It worked almost all too well, or so the legend goes. It's almost quaint to discuss Polybius now, in the age of hyper-targeted Facebook propaganda, military recruiting via Twitch, and the looming specter of deepfakes. The idea that the public would be so terrified of an arcade game is adorable. It goes without saying that urban legends like this were a product of more naive time, a time before such tales would become weaponized, and mutated into the far more dangerous genre of conspiracy theories. Because, yeah, none of those are ever real. The name Polybius itself was likely selected specifically as bait for the inquisitive and easily spooked. The original Polybius was an ancient Greek philosopher born around 208 BC in Megalopolis, Arcadia. He is known for his affinity for cryptozoography and puzzles. He created the Polybius square naturally, as well as his belief that historians should strictly report what they can verify through hard evidence and interviewing witnesses. His name itself means many lives in Greek. Get it? Many lives? I mean, that's another interesting wrinkle there. I didn't see that on his wiki entry, but yeah, many lives, and then also his cipher being combined with the Playfair cipher. Arcadia, many lives, Playfair. It's almost too good a name for a spooky video game. The urban legend of Polybius gained popularity February 6, 2000, when a listing for the game popped up on coinop.org, a digital museum and database for arcade gaming. The page for Polybius listed the game as having been copyrighted in 81, although no such copyright exists, and only briefly mentions bizarre rumors about the title before classifying its history as unknown. Though impossible to confirm without a confession from the man himself, the person believed to have created the post is Kurt Kohler, the owner of the site. Kohler would also tip off writer Dan Electro of GamePro, which at the time claimed to be the world's largest independent multi-platform gaming magazine, to the existence of the story. Eventually, in a 2003 listicle called Secrets and Lies, GamePro came to an inconclusive verdict regarding the veracity of the tip. The story went on to hit Slashdot, the closest thing to going viral in the early 2000s, on August 21st, 2003. But as we, in the age of, say it with me, fake news know, the point of getting the story out there was not to have it debunked. It was to lodge it in the popular imagination of American gamers. At this, Kohler was wildly successful. Polybius had gone on to be the subject of television shows, music videos, documentaries, extensive investigations, an episode of The Simpsons, and has even become a real purchasable game, more than once. Coinop.org has had a similarly long life. It still exists on the internet today, with Polybius remaining its most popular entry. On the page for Polybius are infamous comments left by a user claiming to be a man named Stephen Roach. Roach details his involvement in the game's supposed development, reassembled below for legibility. Marek Vachosek was the programmer who came up with the name Polybius. He had studied Greek mythology at Masaryk University and came up with the name because it sounded quite bold and mysterious, which is what we wanted, quite simply. The inspired graphics combined with the puzzle elements and scintillating gameplay was something to behold. We play-tested it for hours and hours, and it certainly was an addictive game that was well loved professionally and recreationally by all that played it. We then received a phone call stating that there were concerns within the company that the basic graphics, which featured prominently in so many other games of the time, were fine for the average gamer to spend hours at a time without any noticeable physical or mental detriments, but the intense and engrossing gameplay of this new step was very much an unknown quantity, so the game was put back several months due to divided opinion within their board of directors, much to our consternation for breaking our backs to finish it on time. We disbanded shortly afterwards because we didn't want to restrict ourselves to the stringent deadlines of other companies and favored distancing ourselves from the game in case of any lingering recriminations, which could have done a great deal of damage to our personal and professional reputations, which was our livelihood, and with some of us having very young families, this was extremely important to us. As far as I'm aware, no ROMs or otherwise exist unless they remain in the bowels of the company that distributed it. We only received a basic payment in view of the fact that the game was withdrawn without nationwide or international distribution, so we grew to loathe it and was often a curse word wherever we used to meet up and still is today, which is a shame. In his documentary investigating the game called Polybius, the video game that doesn't exist, Stuart Brown of Ahoy claims to have actually tracked down the user who claimed to be Stephen Roach and states unequivocally that his addition to the story is entirely fabricated. In addition to the would-be hoaxers, there were feature films about arcade machines with supernatural powers, which would popularize the concept. In 1984's The Last Starfighter is about a boy so good at video games that aliens recruit him to wage an actual intergalactic war. Then there's Nightmares, a 1983 horror anthology featuring a vignette called The Battle of Bishop about a game so addicting that it actually sucks a young Emilio Estevez into its secret 13th level. The popularity of Polybius' story is such that it transcends other video game tall tales. It's easily more popular than Minecraft's Herobrine, GTA's San Andreas' Sasquatch, or that time people thought Saddam Hussein was trying to conquer the world with a PS2? Wow, I must have missed that one. As mainstream urban legends go, Polybius is probably only slightly less successful than Slender Man or The Hook. But is any of it true? Actually, yes. To understand the truth behind the legend, one must fall down an internet rabbit hole that spans both time and cyberspace. Online listings for Polybius all contain the same blurry photo of the game's cabinet and marquee. There's no way to tell if this physical cabinet ever existed or if it's an early Photoshop job, thanks to its dubious quality. Listings also host the only known screenshot of the game. The screenshot displays the game's title screen, the aforementioned copyright date, and credits its development to a company called Sinneslotion, a word which roughly translates to something along the lines of sense deleting or sensory deprivation in broken German. There is no evidence of any such company having ever existed in Germany, the US, or arcade gaming's capital, Japan, so that's a dead end. A font used for the name Polybius itself is actually quite notable for being so large and colorful during an era when the memory required to produce such an effect was at a serious premium. Only games from powerhouses like Nintendo or Williams were known to spend such high-priced resources on something as fleeting as a title screen. In fact, the lettering is reminiscent of the one used for Nintendo's Versus Pinball and one used for Williams's Bubbles, although not an exact match for either. It even resembles an East German cabinet called Polyplay from the era, although it's unlikely anything this obscure inspired the American legend. Again, there's not much to go on here. Some sources have claimed that the story of Polybius was making the rounds on Usenet as early as 1994, although there is, yet again, no record of this in any existing Usenet archives. This may be a case of the Mandela effect, where groups of people misremember the same events as there was indeed a Pink Floyd-themed puzzle, or a hoax of a puzzle, going around Usenet in the early 90s called Publius Enigma, which became so popular that the name was inexplicably displayed during one of the band's concerts. The puzzle itself is near incomprehensible and has never been solved. Still, other dubious sources have claimed that the gameplay of Polybius was similar to the vector stylings of Rez, Tempest, or Quix. Tempest was extremely popular at the time and known for its mesmerizing graphics, so it's not a stretch to think it may have stuck in the memories of gamers from that era. Cube Quest, similarly, was a visually stunning title that was only in active use for a very short period of time, owing its reliance on sensitive Laserdisc technology. A local arcade can only afford so many high-priced repairs. There's also the people that got sick while playing games like Tempest at the time, just like Polybius. As was the case with Michael Lopez of Beaverton, Oregon, who suffered a sudden migraine while playing Tempest with some friends at the Malibu Grand Prix arcade. Quote, I began to feel a weird sensation in the back of my head, then my vision started going out, little flashing lights, recalls Lopez. Suddenly I got sick and stumbled outside where I threw up all over the parking lot. One of my friends walked with me back home, but we didn't make it all the way there. My head hurt so bad. It got to where I couldn't speak, I couldn't walk anymore. I collapsed on someone's lawn 4 blocks from my house, rolling and screaming in pain. It felt like my head was cracking open. Someone called the cops. That was the first migraine headache I ever had. I've had them off and on my whole life since, but it was freaky because I didn't know what was happening at the time. End quote. So theoretically, it might not have been related to the game. Blame was put on the game's flashing lights and intense visual effects, and the incident was documented by a local paper, as was the case of Jeff Daly, a gamer who suffered a heart attack and died after getting his name on the high score list of the game Berserk. In that case, blame was also put on the stress-inducing arcade cabinet. Similarly, Peter Bukowski also died of heart failure, possibly due to myocardial inflammation while playing Berserk. Then there's Brian Morrow, who after 28 straight hours of playing Asteroids and drinking Coca-Cola got sick and collapsed. Morrow survived, but it's easy to see how the reporting of such events in the northwestern U.S. could lead to paranoia about the long-term effects of this new entertainment medium. It's hard to imagine now, but at the time, gaming was such a new phenomenon that it was labeled a fad and classified as part of the toy industry. Parents were suspicious of the machines that were seemingly out of nowhere mesmerizing a generation of American children. Who could blame them? Game developers have spent decades trying to wring the money out of their audience by making their games attention-grabbing, sensory immersive, and increasingly addictive. If anything, parents today should be more skeptical about the immersive, addictive, gambling-adjacent games that are freely available on every conceivable screen in our homes. You know, that is kind of weird, too. Like, now nobody really bats an eye at all these games and paying for aspects of games and all these things, whereas back in the day, people were deeply concerned even about free video games. But today, as was the case in the 80s, people tend to be more suspicious of their own shadowy government than they are of corporations whose motives are transparent. They want to take your money. Yeah, because the government definitely doesn't want to do that. I mean, wait, has Inverse.com never heard of the IRS? It doesn't help matters that the FBI indeed was conducting top-secret operations out of America's arcades. The Bureau's records indicate that the agency actually was monitoring and subsequently raiding arcades in the Portland area right around the time that stories of players collapsing in arcades had hit the mainstream media. In those days, arcades, which are naturally dark and maze-like, had seedy reputations as hotbeds of gambling, drug activity, and pickpockets looking to prey on teenagers. Though the extent to which arcades captured the public imagination was out of proportion with the actual issues in the establishments, some of that reputation was earned. Cabinets were being repurposed for gambling. People were selling weed in between rounds of Pac-Man. There are pickpockets wherever teenagers tend to gather, especially in the days before cell phones. One more fanciful operation conducted by the FBI included agents rigging classic cabinets like Tempest, Scramble, and Galaxian with cameras and microphones in the hope of catching criminals in the act. Games like Tempest were selected less for their mind control abilities and more because these cabinets featured glass bezels, ideal for sticking cameras behind. The program was so extensive that it briefly caused a shortage of Tempest machines in the Seattle area during the early 80s. Just imagine teenagers watching Men in Black wheeling Tempest machines in and out of arcades every few days. It only makes sense that they would start ascribing outlandish motives to the agents. These stories of mind control and government experiments are also unfortunately completely based in reality. Many people have heard of it by now, but at the time there were only whispers about a CIA program known as MK Ultra, which was pursuing mind control techniques using technology, multimedia, and a whole lot of drugs. The experiments were conducted without the permission of their subjects, who have described the experience as extreme psychological torture. With that in mind, a mesmerizing video game doesn't seem so fantastical. These disturbing stories are all verifiable, but none of them contain the actual game Polybius. To actually play Polybius, you'd have to settle for one of the many fan games developed in tribute to the legend. There's the supposed copy distributed by GoodDealGames.com around April 2004 called Polybius.exe. The game claims to contain its own emulation software and warns players, quote, "The Polybius video game has been linked to impaired memory and psychological changes. Gameplay may cause epileptic seizures in susceptible individuals. Do you still want to continue? Question mark," end quote, before booting into the familiar title screen. Once one presses any key, the game crashes, and another pop-up message explains that it was simply an April Fool's Day joke. Freeware developers Rogue Synapse, known for creating fan-made cabinets of arcade games which never existed, like the one from The Last Starfighter, developed and distributed a game named Polybius in 2007. This version attempts to faithfully recreate the gameplay as described in the urban legend, using trippy visuals and subliminal messages. In an effort to further the immersive prank, the company's owner, Dr. Estelle Vance, registered the URL Sinisloschen, and it trademarked the usage of the name Polybius, though noted that it wasn't an authentic original and was simply an attempt to recreate the Polybius game as it might have existed in 1981. Well, here's the plot twist here. What if that really was the exact game in 1981? And to keep things under wraps, they pretended it was a new game that was somehow trying to recreate the Legend game. I mean, this kind of seems like an operation if there was some kind of MK Ultra connection, or companies contracted to do something like this, or even if there is no MK Ultra connection, it was just some kind of game that got a certain reputation and then was disappeared for whatever reason. I mean, yeah, I don't know. I haven't played that game. Has anybody played the Rogue Synapse version? What do they think about it? The most famous and easily obtained version of Polybius is from developer Llamasoft, who released its game for the PlayStation 4 and PSVR in 2016. Though the game contains vector-like graphics, it's very obviously a modern creation intended to actually be played as a standalone title. It was in fact so popular that it was used for the music video Less Than by 9 Inch Nails in 2017. None of those games are the true Polybius, which, if it ever existed at all, only survives via word of mouth and articles like the one you're reading. Polybius was almost certainly invented by Kurt Kohler to promote his website, which obviously succeeded beyond any reasonable expectation. But in the light of free-to-play mobile games with addicting gotcha mechanics, corporations and the government's hyper-targeting ads on Facebook effectively mind control, and the alphabet soup of federal agencies torturing children, the themes of the legend are more relevant than ever before. In a way, the story of Polybius is entirely true. People were dying while playing addictive video games. Men in Black were using arcade machines in secret operations. The government was, and probably still is, pursuing mind control. The Portland area witnessed all of these things. It just wasn't called Polybius. Or was it? What if there was some kind of like a low budget version, and it wasn't a real game, and they tricked some arcade into like testing out this game? So they created this cabinet, kind of DIY type cabinet, and there was only, let's say there was only one, or maybe two, but whatever. And once the arcade owner found out it wasn't legit, like, what if they pretended it was legit and it wasn't, and then they pulled it because of that? Could it be something related to that, whether Polybius or not? I mean, that's a seemingly innocent explanation, right? And either the game really wasn't that good or whatever, and then it got conflated with all of the other issues in the area at the time. Here's the thing, too, like, a lot of coincidence theorists and those pretending and those reveling in appeal to incredulity, logical fallacies, and pretending this could never be possible, they kind of make the argument, why would the company be named Sonashlen or whatever, sensory deprivation? Obviously, that wouldn't be the real company. It would obviously be a front. I mean, this kind of Dunning-Kruger goofery by those, you know, doing all these mental gymnastics in an attempt to explain away any kind of possibility that some kind of possibly non-official title could exist. Because if you were, let's say it was the CIA and it was an MK Ultra game, why would they put the name of an actual company that could be traced, possibly traced back to them? I mean, they might want to screw around and pick something like Sonashlen or whatever, sensory deprivation, because they wouldn't think that a lot of people spoke German and they wouldn't be able to pick up on that. And they thought it kind of like as an Easter egg. But why the hell would they use the real name that could be traced? I mean, it's just weird. Like, coincidence theorists are a weird bunch, not very logical. You know, another possible theory is, what if, regarding Polyplay, this was a cabinet that was developed in Germany, and so supposedly it had some of the Polyplay cabinets had numerous games in them. And it was very rare, so again, I don't know if it's ever actually been determined how many units were in North America, if any, but apparently there could have been some. And if this was a cabinet that included several different games, that would explain the inconsistent stories regarding Polybius. Also, if it included several different games, perhaps it did include some kind of MK Ultra type game that was only in one of the cabinets, or two, and then that was removed in other versions. And that would explain all of that. So the only thing is, like, they would only have that in the Oregon area. But here's the thing, though. What if they did have it in other areas, but would there be more accounts of it? Or did they just roll them out in such limited fashion that it could have theoretically only been out there for 1 or 2 days in different areas, and then they got information from it, and most people simply don't remember? Would you really remember some random game and its title if it was part of a cabinet that had numerous games within it? I mean, yeah, that's tough. That's tough. That is tough. Now, another interesting theory is if the game never existed, or it existed, like I just said, as part of a multi-game cabinet, was part of the experiment to make it disappear and then re-emerge the legend decades later and see how it would all play out, and have some kind of reverse engineering aspect on people trying to make the game based on the legend, whether the game existed or not. What if that's the true experiment as a whole? So it was always planned to be pulled, and then to see how it would be reconstructed, if at all. And is that the real experiment? Or, of course, as I stated earlier, if there really was the plan, there's an original version, then they pull it, create the legend and the myth, that's all part of the plan and part of the experiment, and then roll out the actual game pretending to be a tribute or a recreation, but it's actually the original game as well. Or some kind of two-part experiment. Would anybody put it past the CIA or some kind of government agency to do something like that? I don't know. Okay, on the Reddit AMA, there's a post here by user since deleted 6 years ago. I played the arcade game Polybius in Portland, Oregon in '81. Ask me anything. Wikipedia says that Polybius is an arcade game described in an urban legend which is said to have induced various psychological effects on players. The story describes players suffering from amnesia, night terrors, and a tendency to stop playing all video games. Around a month after its supposed release in 1981, Polybius is said to have disappeared without a trace. There is no evidence it really existed. I was there. Portland, Oregon, 1981. I played it. It wasn't very spooky. I heard about the people who got sick. I don't think anybody actually died, just got headaches. I must have been the expletive music. It was insanely loud and annoying. Anyway, ask me anything about it. Someone asked, wait, I thought this game was an urban legend. Even The Simpsons made a joke of it. Okay, since this is apparently legit, is it fun? Was it popular among the other games? What was the premise of the game? Response here by user since deleted. It wasn't particularly fun, but then again, back then we only had games like Pac-Man and Asteroids. It looked a lot like Asteroids, played a bit like it too. It had the same style, black screen with white outlines. It was popular since games took a while to make and the arcade only got about a new game every month. It was always exciting when a new game arrived at the arcade and everybody would play it. Polybius was no exception. The premise was simple. You move around, you shoot stuff. It didn't have a story or characters for that matter. You just flew around and shot stuff. You played as a small ship-like thing, and then the enemy was a single, much larger ship thing that would fire off small projectiles for you to shoot. There was no end. You just shot the projectiles. It wasn't a particularly exciting or innovative game, but like I said before, new games were rare. The whole urban legend side of it is completely false. The part about the men in black who came to work on the machines is both true and false. The arcade machines were taken down and put up by some larger arcade warehouse company. I don't remember the name. The workers did wear black suits on the day they came to mess with the machines. They came on Halloween, and their explanations were that they were dressed up as FBI agents. Only 2 men came, so it's plausible they wore a group costume. They weren't the regular workers, though. There were 2 who usually came, and everybody knew them. They were nice to the kids at the arcade and sometimes bought us pizza. These guys were different, and I never saw them again. They still made conversation, but they were more stiff. I'm not confirming anything. I think urban legend is BS. I'm just recounting my memories. I asked my brother, and all he remembers is exactly what I remember. The only bad thing it gave you were headaches, the music was loud and obnoxious, blips and bloops. A friend of mine was particularly into it and held the high score. He did end up committing suicide, but that was only a few years ago and for a completely unrelated reason. A few people got sick, but lots of people at the arcade got sick. It was a germy place. People came there every day and touched the machine, for God's sake. The urban legend part is false, but the game itself was very real. When this happened, I was only about 12. My friends spanned from 12 to 14. My brother and his friends were all about 16, and they were big bullies. I would go to the arcade every day after school with my friends. We would play there until supper time, where we would go to our consecutive houses. My brother and his gang would hang around the arcade because the computer nerds and video game nerds would go there, and he picked on them and took their money. Occasionally, he would enter the arcade to check on me or to get food from the pizza parlor inside. He played the games sometimes and played Polybius once or twice. He doesn't remember anything strange about it. And that's all there is there, folks. I mean, quite a bland post about it, but this guy seemingly remembers not only the game, but he remembers that on Halloween, workers wore FBI costumes or something to move the games out, and they weren't the usual workers. Okay, interesting account there. You would think there'd be a lot more accounts, unless, of course, the game was not there for a full month. Like, if they only had it there for a day or two. I mean, that would severely narrow the amount of people that could have played it. There's another post here by Kyle Raymond 2 years ago on Reddit, the subreddit ARG. Now, ARG's alternate reality games, an interactive network narrative that uses the real world as a platform and employs transmedia storytelling to deliver a story that may be altered by players' ideas or actions. You know, it's weird, though, just reading this now. I mean, is that what Polybius really is? An alternate reality game? Part of the game is the legend of the game? I actually don't know that much about ARGs. Apparently some people find them interesting, but I don't know much about them. But reading this post here, I played Polybius in 1985. Let me begin by saying I understand why the legend of Polybius is so attractive to many. I understand its appeal to retro gaming enthusiasts, as I myself am one, having grown in the early days when 8-bits were common and some machines, most of them, didn't have music. I know why Polybius is so popular. It runs on vague memories, shadowy recollections of a bygone era, as well as the notion of sheer possibility that anything, no matter how implausible, could have existed for a glimpse in the past, a shimmer, a moment seen by few and understood by none, and then rushing back into obscurity. What I have for you today is not a vague memory. It is not a half-baked recollection. I know for a fact that I played Polybius in 1985. There are some who claim to have worked on Polybius. I am not one of them. What Sinislotion is who worked there, whether it was a front, I really have no idea. I only played it. When I say I played it, I do not mean I remember playing something similar, or that, as for many, Polybius looms as a retrospective shadow in the back of my mind. I mean, I played it. I stood in front of it, stared at the screen, pressed its buttons. For the last few months, I have watched many documentaries on the subject. I sometimes try and convince myself that the memory I have is not of Polybius, but of some other game. I think about Polybius and Berserk, but those are cheap tales with no connection. I think about Polyplay and Berserk, but those are cheap tales with no connection. They are excuses from people who would not believe, scrambling for order in a world of rumors and hearsay, aka coincidence theories. Polybius is not Berserk any more than it is Space Invaders. Polybius is its own game. Neon screen, yes, perhaps not neon green, but a somber, even macabre aqua. When I say I have distinct memories of playing this game, I do. but they are not unpleasant memories. Let me say that up front. I hold the same memories about Polybius as one would towards Breakout or Space Invaders or any other game of that era. I look back on Polybius not with fear, but with a kind of disconnected nostalgia. Nostalgia is a powerful tool. It can make people remember anything, even something that never existed. It can draw new intrigue if a dark spin is put on a seemingly innocent activity. I have no dark spins or gritty details. I only have straight facts. This is not a false memory. It is as good a memory, I think, as one can have. The dropping of quarters into slots, the dark lighting, conducive to sucking a player into the world of a certain game, noises of joysticks being rattled, all these phenomena are atmospheric, their purpose being to create an environment conducive to successful gameplay, and in turn to funneling money into the pocket of an arcade owner. I understand the appeal of such an environment where real money is spent on a service and thus the stakes are real. Today's arcades, all too often, cheap facsimiles of the real thing, and their business model is not the same as it was all those years ago. Some, such as Dave & Buster's, addict children to financial irresponsibility with a fake credit card which can be slid up and down running the wallet dry. Others provide no incentive to win because they offer an all-day bracelet and hand tag, which the player can play all they want, reminiscing about those bygone days. I still believe there is no system better than the old quarter system, which encourages gameplay on a level which no other system can accomplish. It provides a monetary system, but as quarters are physically limited objects, unlike a phony credit card, one must play every game as if it would be their last, and once their resources are depleted, they will have nothing to do and thus will leave. Such is the model of an arcade owner interested in making money, but not one whose greed outweighs their sensibility. One must enjoy their time gaming because it is limited by monetary constrictions. Every so often I encounter the rare arcade that still uses this model, which allows players to play as they would in the 80s with real money and real stakes. When I find one such as this, I usually stick around for a while. Sometimes I snap photos next to the consoles, I always bring a roll of quarters, and when they're gone, I accept that no game can be played forever and drive home knowing that I've had a good day. I still haven't seen another Polybius console. I believe that the end of classic games came with the Game Boy. Some would disagree with me on that, but it is my opinion that without the aforementioned monetary restrictions, one does not play every game to the best of their ability. There is no reason to play well because all it takes is the press of a button. Games should be treated like a limited asset as they are. Entropy is inevitable, and mice can chew through the wires of old cabinets and dust can disrupt the circuitry. Electricity is not magic, and information is stored in bits. It is today estimated that it would take the area the size of a large city for a machine that could hold certain multiplications of bits. If video games are not treated as a limited commodity, which they are, then the games lose their power. As a kid in Seattle, I was taught that I am a member of the economy, that dropping quarters in an amusement machine was the same as dropping quarters in a self-service car wash. That one was for amusement, the other for cleanliness, but that both mechanisms were designed to support an economy, and back then I thought it was pretty cool that I was serving as a member of an economy, a consumer performing by basic function. Today, the gaming industry is motivated by greed and gimmicks, and every time I see an ad for a season pass, I feel like punching my console out. I believe innovation in games is dead. You may think I'm bitter, that I hold a grudge towards the new games. This is inevitable. Nostalgia, as I have hinted at, is a kind of unavoidable phenomenon. A ceaseless battle between the old and the new, it is an integral part of a time-based universe such as ours. Without nostalgia, we would never learn from our mistakes or treasure the present as it swiftly becomes the past. This, at its core, is the appeal of Polybius, a game which was never appreciated. A game whose coin slot was devoid of quarters. A game which felt no love, and over time grew into a spiteful and quasi-demonic entity through rumor and speculation. A game which nobody held nostalgia for until its existence was remembered and it was resurrected from the shadowy and uncertain past. That's what I believe it was, an innocent enough game blown out of proportion by the owner of CoinOp. Maybe he played it. Maybe he had heard about it from somebody else. I don't know. And with his secretive nature, we may never know. I have no sympathy for him. He took an innocent game, one which held no ill will, and used it in the pioneer days of the web to draw traffic towards his site with vague information and deliberate deception. Such a behavior is reprehensible, and I don't condone it. The point is that Polybius did exist. Why it was never recorded in any catalog until 2001, I don't know. The facts are this. There are 7 billion people in the world. In the 80s, there were a few less. Still billions of people. Gaming from the beginning has been a medium which relies on novelty and self-sufficiency. It is a medium which can brag about the intricacies of its design and circuitry. In the early 80s, the market experienced its first real surge, an explosion of new ideas and a new way of thinking about electronics. Until then, electronics were seen as a niche. Electricity powered your toaster, but it was as useful as water, a force which coursed through cords but could only move a switch or turn a lever. In 1979, with the advent of Pong and the formation of Atari, this mindset changed. Electronics went from niche to mainstream. Were we 80s children proficient in coding, or even in the most basic algebra? No, not much. I look back on my youth as a time of pizza and payphones and listening to bad rock. These days, coding is treated as near essential in any curriculum. Still, it was the first line of games which sparked an interest in electronics. It was also due to the limited success of the machines, the fact that the arcades closed and gameplay was limited by how many quarters you had. This was what drove innovation, the race to find the best game. I don't know what was going through the heads of those early designers. I've never designed a game, wouldn't know the first step, so I speak here from the perspective of a relative layman. What I believe the goal was in those days was to create the best game, which functioned the best, and could provide the most amusement, while at the same time being the most effective possible investment for the potential arcade owner. A good machine would please both consumer and distributor. It is this, I think, which ultimately doomed Polybius to the back burner. It was not a very efficient game from what I can recall of it. It was not even slightly popular. It was, in other words, doomed to fail. To gather dust in the back room with the pool table and the pinball machines, while the big earners, Pac-Man, Space Invaders, soon the fledgling Mario jumping barrels would be at the front, followed closely by a line of eager teens. Novelty in the new medium was appreciated and rewarded. True experimentation was not. Atari and Williams and Midway were not the only designers of games back then. As with any explosion in a medium, competition and a rapid onset of wannabe developers was inevitable. Were the new technologies scarce? Were they protected by patents and red tape, bureaucratic? Certainly. Atari in those days was out to make itself the king, as were Williams and others. But were they the only companies with access to the new medium? No. To the modern developer, a circuit board from one of these consoles would be child's play. To a few crafty developers in the first boom, the machinery was not exactly child's play, which can only be said with the power of hindsight, but it was at the very least possible to create something new. This was before worldwide communication and schematics were difficult to obtain. But in the corporate hierarchy, I can only assume some industry secrets were leaked. Designs and patents flowed down from the big fish to the little nibbling guppies. This led to innovation. Is Polybius implausible? Yes, if you see it as some evil front for a government operation. Well, and even then, not necessarily. It's certainly not implausible when seen as a game and nothing more. In those days, there were countless machines floating around, all from companies that are now defunct. Heck, even Atari thought they would be the big dogs, and they seemed unstoppable, but they were replaced by Nintendo. I can think of many instances of this. The average Seattle arcade, of which there were quite a few, held on average about 200 consoles, maybe more. These were always moving around from spot to spot. The winners, the big dogs, and Space Invaders would stay, while the failures would quickly be shipped back to the manufacturer or another less frequented arcade. These failures were a dime a dozen. Cheap wood, cheap paint, awful gameplay. I don't regret the loss of most of them. This does not mean, however, that all of them were bad. I remember an arcade which had its own house game. The guy behind the counter, who had a mustache and looked Asian, told me he had designed it from scratch in his garage, and it was set up in the front room, free to play because it had virtually no appeal, and was the passion project of the man who designed it. I remember it as a distinct touch to an arcade, one which today would likely not exist. Other games were not so unique. They were shoveled together by a small company, walked in and after a few days walked out. This is how any successful economy works, through the power of selection. The popular go on to win accolades, the weak are shoveled into the trash. This seems callous in hindsight. I recall playing at least 2 games in those arcades which today yield 0 results on Google. It is assumed that all media can be found online, but this is not the case. Plenty of media from 6 or 7 billion people slips from the public consciousness. There are lists of hundreds of lost movies, TV shows, etc., all forgotten because they were not particularly innovative or interesting or compelling. They were the duds. That's actually a good point. I do remember looking up movies which I had seen and there were no listings at all, and then years and years and years later, I guess when copies were somehow found, they started popping up. Is that the same for this game? But since there were so few, new copies would never pop up, so it would be lost forever, basically? Because if the games were trashed or they're still in some kind of warehouse that nobody knows about, if there weren't that many cabinets, I mean, that is theoretically plausible. Especially if it was made by some kind of low-end or knockoff developer. Like, what if it was by some kind of knockoff type company? I mean, using fonts similar to Williams games. I mean, if this was some kind of knockoff, possibly like some kind of illegal knockoff, I mean, that could also possibly explain why some government agents might have wanted the machines to find out where they came from. I mean, I would say that that's worthy of some investigation, the knockoff arcade machine rabbit hole. All forgotten because they were not particularly innovative or interesting or compelling, they were the duds. At the time, they were shoveled and scrapped. Now, with the power of retrospection, we know that media should be preserved for future generations, but in the past, especially with an uncertain market like video games, these principles were put aside. Confusion and misinformation were common. Games were discarded, shoveled under. Polybius was one. I would not be surprised if the full list surpassed 1,000. Human knowledge and memory is incomplete, will always be incomplete. Humans are fallible creatures, prone to suggestion and bias and corruption. That said, I must point out that all of the games scrapped in those frontier times, Polybius was not uninteresting or poorly designed. It was sufficient. It wasn't Pac-Man, there were no marketable characters or remarkable atmosphere, but it was well made. There was no bloat, and every button worked fine. The joystick was maneuverable, the graphics were vector graphics, as many have claimed, but the online simulation isn't close. How could it be? Whoever made it never played the real thing. Still, I find it odd that it would be assumed to be a vector game. It was. I suppose my encounter with Polybius could be chalked up to the fact that I've always tried to root out the obscure. Back then, everything was Pac-Man. He was a hit, there were lines and lines trying to beat the highest score. Same went for Space Invaders. Real crowds around those. Around Tetris and Galaga, there were fewer. Around Pong, a mere handful. By 85, nobody cared about Pong anymore. I played Pong in the 90s. The rest were up to chance. One person, 1 minute, none the next. Some that weren't played enough were shut off. At the request of the guy at the desk, they could be turned back on, but he would give you a sly smirk, as if to say that he didn't want to have to check every single coin slot, and you'd probably have more fun playing Pac-Man anyway. I always went for the ones that were less crowded. I don't like lines, I guess. Some were willing to wait hours for their chance at those little yellow dots, but I wasn't. There were, as I said, at least 200 machines per arcade, some with more, and each arcade was distinct from the others, with a different layout and atmosphere. I played Polybius in 1985. It wasn't the first time or the last time I visited an arcade, but it is distinct in my memory from the others. Polybius I only played twice over the span of 2 months, and after that it was pulled. I can't say I expected less. Even the Space Invader had more persona than Polybius, whose design was stark and futuristic. Green lines against black, a few colors sprinkled into the mix, but for the most part, a pretty bleak game. It wasn't an explosion of anything, least of all seizure-inducing strobe lights. It was in the back room. Anyone who's ever been to an arcade knows that most of the rooms, if not all of them, will have no windows, might be accessible by a short flight of stairs which puts them at a lower level, and will be hard to find, especially in a larger complex. This atmosphere is conducive to a kind of claustrophobia. This can be beneficial if you're trying to connect with the game and get in the zone. The same principle goes for major supermarket chains which don't have windows to put customers in the zone of shopping. There is no natural light. If there was, people would notice the time. Back rooms in arcades, and to an extent the front rooms, are designed to make the player see the screen and nothing else. Arcades are less lit than supermarkets and always atmospheric. The back room in question wasn't run down, and there was nobody else in there, but it still held a sense of wonder for me. In the middle, there was an air hockey table. On the edges were cabinets and a bubblegum machine. The only big seller in there was Juno First. The rest were rinky-dink little things. Interesting, all of them. Polybius was nestled between the bubblegum machine and another one that had a yellow cabinet with white stripes on the sides. You may have noticed something, which is that I saw Polybius in 1985, but it was supposedly released in 1981. Either it wasn't released in 1981 because it was steps ahead of Pong, at least Pac-Man quality, or it was, and they circulated for a while after that. Who knows, they could have circulated until 89. This is, of course, running on the supposition that the machines were not recalled by the CIA or FBI or the Illuminati within a scant period of release, and they were slowly made defunct by natural economic processes, survival of the fittest. The default loading screen was, as many accounts show, black, Sinaslashen logo at the bottom, Polybius at the top. Nothing else. No animations, graphics, movement, etc. After about 5 seconds after depositing your coin in the slot, gameplay started. It was as simple as that. Many games play footage of the game while not being played, but Polybius was different. Just the logo. You had to pay to see what you were getting. Does this mean the game was evil? No. Maybe it couldn't afford the software necessary to run footage during an activity. Maybe the designers thought they could hook more players with just the title. That line of reasoning didn't pan out, of course, because most people at least like to know what they're buying before they buy it. Still, it was something that set Polybius apart from the crowd. Sinaslashen, I think, is integral here. The Germans were at the forefront of technology even when they were separated. America was competent, but as usual, Japan and Germany were quick to get the edge. I don't know if Polybius was Western or Eastern. The good design tells me it was probably Western, spurred by innovation and grants from tech giants, but the minimalism suggests an Eastern perspective. Maybe it was depressing because it was born from a broken country. When you live on the vodka and rags, there's not much to be cheery about, especially not colorful little yellow orbs eating ghosts. Polybius was depressing not because it had a story or characters, but because when you looked at the cabinet, you just felt sorry for it. You felt like someone had tried to make a decent game and the controls were fine, but the game was dismal and sad. Distant, like cries echoed on a foggy night down a slowly winding river. It wasn't scary. It was just pathetic. Regardless, it should be noted that Polybius was from a country torn in two. Germany in the 80s was nothing like Germany today, and the same could be said for much of Europe, as the Soviet Union uttered its final breaths. This guy's a really good writer. Part of this depressing allure could be attributable to its thin physique. There's a photo that's been circulating of a Polybius cabinet. It's thin, lacks the girth of other games, looks gaunt and somewhat imposing. While I can't prove or disprove the authenticity of that photo, I will say that the Polybius cabinet did have a unique shape, and that the cabinet in the picture could have been it. It was thin, about 6 feet to the top, maybe 2 feet across, and the marquee flashed occasionally. That's something I haven't heard anyone say. While the title card would remain unchanged unless it was unplugged, the marquee would flash about every 5 minutes, just a quick blink off and then back on. If you weren't astute, you could miss it. I still don't know why such a feature would be necessary. It couldn't save power and it certainly didn't attract anybody. Maybe it was just a random quirk on that one machine, but with no other machines to compare it to, it's hard to say. The panels at the edges of the screen curved slightly inward. Some of the unknown games had cheap wood barely able to hold a processor, but Polybius was sturdy enough. It was a recognizable console. It set itself apart from the competition, but not through flashiness or gimmicks. It was a game first and foremost. On the side next to the gum machine, the only one visible, the other side was obscured by the yellow machine, there was just the Polybius logo. No Sinaslashen, black all over. I earned the money for my game addiction at a local burger place. About 1/3 of my salary went to the arcades, another third toward my college fund, and the rest to miscellaneous expenses. At this time, I didn't have a car, so I could ride my bike anywhere I needed, which usually wasn't very far. The burger place went defunct in 2000, but it had some of the best burgers in Washington, juicy and thick with good slices of cheese, and each came with a toothpick stuck in it to hold it together. Checkered napkins and the like. It wasn't a chain, though, and it wasn't especially fancy, so they weren't able to hold on. Sometimes I think about the burgers. I spent hours making the ketchup just right, flipping them over. I was proud of each one I made. My dad got on me a lot, but as long as I was able to hold an honest job, he wasn't too upset, and as I said, 1/3 went to a college fund. College never really panned out for me. Today I supervise construction sites, which isn't the worst job in the world, but not the best. Lots of people who are into video games went into that market, and some of them hit it big. I didn't because I didn't know anything about programming the things, only about playing them. I feel comfortable where I'm at, but I feel that if I had gone into games, I might have enjoyed my life more. The current job is boring, and my only real respite is going out and going to various arcades in the Northwest region, documenting each, rating them, etc. It's a nice hobby. Of course, when you dropped a quarter in the slot of Polybius, you heard it clunk, and then there was a short beep, and the title card would stay for about 5 seconds before the game started. Polybius was short on sound effects. Of course, lots of games back then didn't have a full soundtrack or anything, but Polybius just had a boop or a beep at random intervals. The sound effects, like the short bursts of color, seemed like added window dressing from the developers, who may have realized that the game would be too boring without them. The colors and sounds were unsynchronized, though, and happened at random intervals, so they ended up being more of a distraction than anything else. The gameplay itself was simple enough, pretty easy to learn on your first try, but as the game went on, it progressively got more difficult, and the graphics sped up. The vector graphics were pretty good in all fairness. They looked sharp, all the angles lined up to give the game an excellent feeling of perspective, that within the four corners of the screen there was a world beyond your imagination, that you could step into the screen itself. I don't know much about perspective, but the game had a lot of depth to it. It didn't feel like it was flat. It was very well rounded and three-dimensional all over. The lines were trippy, sure, not seizure-inducing, but artistic. If there's one thing I'd call Polybius, it was artsy. Whoever made it not only wanted to give the player a captivating time at the buttons, but also wanted to showcase their prowess, maybe even expand what games could do. Polybius, as I think I said, was very experimental. Pac-Man and the other mainstream stuff was flashy and blunt. Polybius, while not terrifying, had a kind of mystique built around it. I believe this mystique was intentional. However, as the years have gone by, this mystique has been usurped by an aura of malevolence. Polybius was far from malevolent. However, back in the day, games were rated as were comics. It was the Reagan administration, and family values had been set back down after the countercultural revolution, and thus Polybius, with its swirling shapes and lack of any coherent story, was probably 9 times out of 10 set as far away from the entrance as possible. A game that nobody could understand was not worth an arcade owner's time, and it certainly wasn't worth some kid going to their parents and telling them about the creepy game that was more complex than it let on. They could get sued for even the slightest infraction, let alone having some advanced CIA spyware. A game as experimental as Polybius was ahead of its time, and therefore treated as a business risk. And personally, I would agree, a game as strange as Polybius could raise some eyebrows. Foreign is what Polybius was. It was from another country, from an unknown developer. It tried to expand overseas, but I'm sure this ultimately cost Sinaslashin more than they spent on it. They probably didn't see too many quarters floating back over the Atlantic. Europe is oftentimes more progressive than America. They have crazy ideas, which to the American right seem insane. This was the case even in 1981. The gameplay was straightforward. There was a score in the upper left as well as a high score. I beat the high score on my first attempt. It was very low. It was random, however, not a round number, so I assume it wasn't the default high score, but rather that someone played the game before me. Their initials, if I recall, were TH. There was only one high score, so no way of knowing exactly how many people had played it. In the early days, scores varied wildly from game to game, and the same, of course, goes for pinball. What might be 10,000 points on one game might only be 100 on another. Effort and diligence are subjective depending on the game mechanics and vary wildly. From what I saw of the game, 10,000 was a pretty high score. 12,000 was about how far I got before the game ended, and as far as I could tell, I pressed each button at the correct moment and held the joystick with confidence. Speaking of buttons, there were 3 altogether. All of them were labeled in German. The joystick was about 2 inches high. The buttons were about 1 inch in diameter. I have no idea what the buttons said, but over time as the game progressed, I was able to discern essentially what each of them was supposed to do. The one on the left took you to the left, the one on the right took you to the right, and the one in the middle took you ahead. The joystick was necessary for smaller maneuvers, but it was hooked up well and was very accurate. The input on the game was excellent. The smallest touch would move the objects on the screen just that amount. There was no lag and no bloat, as I said. Whoever designed it knew what they were doing, and although Polybius was obviously low budget, it was maybe even better than some Williams titles. I think this was in part because it was bare bones. It wasted very little time on a recognizable design or aesthetic, and thus it was able to create one. I don't know if that makes any sense, but the swirling lines and shape of this game were unlike anything else on the market at the time. Take Space Invaders. In Space Invaders, although the shapes are somewhat abstract, they do represent tangible things in the real world. You are a spaceship, the Space Invaders are invading. Same thing goes for Pac-Man. Pac-Man is a physical object, a concept which can be understood and described. Even something abstract like Atari Breakout is recognizable and distinct. Polybius was not distinct. It was crowded, littered, and yet at the same time orderly. I knew what was going on and how to manipulate the buttons where everything was at, and I was even able to get a good idea of the dimensions and spatial configurations of the world within the screen. Was Polybius designed and released in 1981? I kind of doubt it. The graphics are just too good, and to think that something on Polybius's level could be released just 2 years after Pong is stretching it a bit. Perhaps it was released in 83 or even 85, and the designers said it was from 81 to give it more credibility and appeal. That's actually interesting. If the 1981 copyright screen is a fake, everyone would think it was 81, even if it was released later. That's actually pretty interesting. Or if we want to go further down the conspiracy rabbit hole, is this some kind of occult World War II Nazi Germany technology that was really far ahead of its time and it was implemented into an arcade game by 81? That would be quite mind-shocking. I mean, of course, the Nazi Germany seemed to be incredibly ahead of the rest of the world in various areas of technology. Some obviously believe it's a result of reverse engineering some kind of alien technology or medium channeling interdimensionally and things of that nature. But regardless, is that also why Sinaslashin is just used as like a cover name or something and nobody can find out anything about this? Even programmers can lie. This is important to remember. I played the game in 85. I don't know how many other machines there were, who was on them, how many functions the game had, or even what the real objective was. I don't know who Sinaslashin was, whether they were one person or multiple people, or whether they were German. I assume they were because although Sinaslashin is mangled German, the buttons seem to be labeled in accurate enough German. And English is mangled all the time by native English speakers. I believe that if Polybius was American, it would have garnered more fans. But if it had been American, it wouldn't have been Polybius. I played it once more at the end of the 2-month span it held at that arcade. When I say 2 months, it may be lower or higher than that. It didn't stay long. For comparison, Tetris stayed at that arcade until 87, and when it was removed, a lot of people got upset. They ended up reinstalling it in 89, and the arcade was demolished in 94. Tetris was popular, Polybius wasn't. The second time I played it, it had also come in pumped full of the more popular games, and as a result, Polybius wasn't as exciting as it had been the first time I discovered it. My high score was still there, an indicator of just how neglected Polybius was, how few people played it within a 2-month span. I beat it pretty easy. I don't know how far the game could possibly go on. I know there must have been limits to how much you could have been programmed in, but the designs and patterns on the game seemed nearly infinite. Maybe they were randomly generated, but it seemed as if the second time had started out just like the first, but I played for at least a half hour more the second time, and the patterns became more intricate and interesting. The colors faded out after about an hour, as did the sounds, until there were only neon aqua lines and a black background. A little unsettling, but not sinister. The strangest part is, I don't know how the games ended each time. I don't know how a game of Polybius could be ended. I knew how to operate the controls and what to do, what to hit, where to go, and so on, but I still don't know what I was meant to avoid. I lasted pretty long without any obstacles, so I assumed the incidents that could end your game were few and far between, that the game wasn't easy to lose. This is also economically inefficient, as with many games, the player wants a good challenge, but it should be easy to lose. If you let go of the buttons for a moment or release the joystick, you'll crash into a wall and the next player can stick their quarters in the slot. A novice can play Pac-Man for 5 minutes at best. Any good game has obstacles to separate the weak from the strong, to hurry up the line and maximize the quarter intake. There shouldn't be enough obstacles to discourage the player altogether, but enough to keep the line moving and to ensure that someone can't hog a game for very long. Back then, the only extensions to be seen were on stuff like Pac-Man Plus, where one extra life was seen as some kind of industry-shattering development. Polybius was more hypnotic. I don't mean hypnotic in a malevolent sense. It certainly didn't induce seizures, but it was pleasant. It was a game, I think, designed not to have a long line because it had virtually zero appeal to your average hormone-laden arcade rat, but also because games were long. You could probably not do anything for at least 5 minutes and the graphics would run along smoothly. The Europeans pay close attention to a pleasant experience, whether it's a stroll in the Parisian vineyards or a hike up the Norwegian cliffs. Germany, torn though it was no exception to this rule because it was pleasant yet somber. Not unsettling, but not appealing. It may very well have been from the East half. It was fun to play, and I remember standing there and thinking about how I might invite a few friends one day and we could try to beat my high score, but I realized that they had shorter attention spans than I did. They'd probably find it boring, and moreover, I knew deep down that I wouldn't be playing Polybius ever again. Good things are all too often not around for very long, and as I said goodbye to Polybius the second time, I knew it wouldn't last long in a world of competition between American giants, a race to the top. The continuous drive for improvement in video games is somewhat like the screen of Polybius, near infinite and yet ultimately futile. Apart from the title card and the gameplay, there was a game over screen. In it, the letters were of the same font as the title, neon aqua but smaller. It was devoid of anything else. I only saw it twice, but it was there. It said game over in English, an odd choice since the buttons were labeled in German, and maybe it had been programmed to say game over in English and the buttons were painted on and couldn't be changed. Those three screens were all that composed Polybius, ultimately an economical design. With the power of hindsight, it's hard not to wish I had developed my habit of collecting memorabilia earlier in life. I wish as much as you do that I could provide some sort of photo of the machine, or a scrap of its paint. But the problem with proving the existence of something from the past nobody cared about is that odds are nobody will remember it, and odds are also that any proof which could be brought up could be doctored. It's by sheer dumb luck that somebody, probably the coin-op guy, maybe one of his friends, remembered this and turned it into an urban legend. Maybe it wasn't even the coin-op guy's intention to do so. The original listing is innocuous and innocent enough. I know that Polybius was real. I played it. I hope I've convinced you to look into it. I don't think there were any ulterior motives behind this game. The game was a game and nothing more, and mind control was far from possible back then. Or was it? Some people have questioned why Polybius doesn't show up in any gaming magazines from the period, and as an active participant in that period, I can say without a doubt that Polybius simply wasn't enough of a hit to warrant being mentioned in any mainstream publication. In the 80s, the idea of an independently made game was non-existent, and the idea that games could be used to demonstrate artistic prowess was even further from anyone's heads. Games were used as a tool to accomplish what couldn't be done with humans with a board game, and while they were a new and novel idea wherein electrons were manipulated and controlled by human input, they were not used for artistic reasons. Polybius was ahead of its time by a near immeasurable level, even more so if the year 1981 is accurate. The fact that we may never know who Sinoslashin were or how they conducted business is a tragedy that, with hindsight, grows larger. But the fact that the game and its developers were forgotten for 20 or so years hardly means its existence is a myth. Lack of evidence is not evidence in itself. I think back to the high scores and those initials TH. Someone else did play it. But I'll never know who they were or how the information trickled down, how reality became myth, how facts became fiction. And Polybius is interesting in that while it is a real game, it cannot be researched on the internet. This, I think, is what sets it apart from most lost media. That people have lost faith in its existence, and that the negative stigma of mind control has made many people not want to go searching for it. I don't know if I would enjoy playing it if it was found. I was young back then, and my impressions of it may be different now that I've matured, but I think part of the reason why Polybius may never be found is because its very nature is one of utmost secrecy. I don't believe this secrecy was intentional. I believe it was a byproduct of a long line of decisions, and Polybius is only one thread in the history of mankind, but it is a very interesting thread nonetheless. It wasn't a secret operation or some training simulator, it was just a game, probably put together by some very skilled people. I've visited at least 50 arcades and none of them have had it. I never expect them to. One arcade had a fake one, but the fake ones just can't compare to the real deal. I liked Polybius. It was a fun game even though I only played it twice. I guess I thought naively that it would be around forever, that people would remember every game I knew, every facet of culture I knew. I was an idealist. Humanity is bad at remembering things, even worse at determining what's false and what's real. And at the end of the day, Polybius will likely never be found. Or will it? So a poetic post there on Reddit by this individual claiming to have played this game. Now, you know what's interesting? The comparison to movies and other lost media. I mean, super low budget, zero budget indie movies made by total non-professionals. I mean, how many really are lost to time? Like, let's say from the 80s or the early 80s. Obviously, you would think a Hollywood studio film wouldn't be lost to time, or like an independent music album made by non-professionals, some kind of indie release by maybe even an unofficial company that never even registered. Is that what happened here with this arcade game? It was simply an independent release that might have not even been an official release, possibly involving some legal issues. Other people are actually speculating it was some kind of prototype game for even Atari or a major company that used fake names like Sinaslashin or whatever as either some kind of inside joke or to cover up that it was some kind of prototype game and they wanted to gauge its popularity, and then when it wasn't that good, they decided not to go through with it or something of that nature. One more Reddit post I was able to find by user since deleted on AMA. I programmed the game called Polybius. Ask me anything. My name is Klaus Saller. I was a West German programmer for the company Sinaslashin in the early 80s. I would like to clear up the myths surrounding the game Polybius. If the game I helped create is even related to the myth on the internet. Polybius was not at all related to mind control or addiction or anything of the sort. The game never got a release. It was noted as being a psychedelic experience, however. The game started out as an idea to combine the raster graphics seen in games like Donkey Kong and Galaga with vector graphics seen in games like Tempest and Asteroids to create a strange and engrossing experience for the player. The gameplay mostly resembled the latter half, however, as we ended up only using raster graphics for backgrounds and special effects. Only one PCB was ever made, and I am unsure of its fate. We were proud of our creation, but the manufacturing cost for the PCB was too expensive due to the aforementioned use of both vector and raster. I recently became aware that this game has become legendary on the internet because of Retro Ahoy's video on the topic. Before this, I was unaware that this was even a relevant subject. I have checked the page on Polybius on the CoinOp webpage. It's completely false, but the screenshot does look like an early build of the game. I have no idea how they managed to get that screenshot, and it doesn't really matter. Sinaslashin didn't last long after that, and we went bankrupt. We went our separate ways, and I haven't seen the team who worked on the game in years. I taught computer science from 83 to 91 to secondary school students before retiring. Yes, Polybius was almost a real game. The story about it being released in America is false. I would be happy to answer any questions. Someone asked, how do we know you're telling the truth? How do you think the rumors got started? Unfortunately, I don't have any proof to offer, and frankly, I'm not very concerned about trying to go out and find any. We only ever worked on this one game before going bankrupt due to poor financial management. I have no idea how the rumors got started either. I suspect it was simply serendipity that the name of this urban legend lined up with the game we created. Okay, but he's mentioning Sinaslashin. If he didn't mention that and the screen being the same, I mean, is it plausible another game by the name Polybius was in the process of being created and never was created? Is that a coincidence? Someone asked if he had a ROM. He responded, no. Unless one of the floppy disks from our old workspace somehow survived, no ROMs exist to my knowledge. Do most people these days even know what a floppy disk is? Alright, so the final theory on Polybius that I am going to float here is this. So this might be the Bruce McGuire theory. Again, I'm not claiming anything is true or not true. With all of the controversy at the time going on about video games, whether they're harmful, is it possible some kind of group, some kind of so-called activists, designed a cabinet, mainly unofficial, that would cause people to stop playing video games, and they somehow got them installed in certain arcades because their goal was to make people sick that played it so that they would stop playing games altogether. And when this dastardly plot was discovered, the game was pulled from all the arcades it was in. And it was discovered rather quickly. Now, why it would all be covered up, I don't know about that. Maybe it just wasn't well known. Maybe the arcade owners somehow got hoodwinked into getting the cabinets in, thinking that there was some kind of official released game when it wasn't. And the goal all along was possibly born out of some kind of benevolent ideology of trying to get kids to stop playing games. And of course that failed. Is that really the truth behind Polybius? I mean, I don't know. Let the MINDSHOCK listeners decide. So, anybody out there, does anybody remember this game? And as I mentioned at the beginning, it would be curious for people to, I'm assuming people have done this, to comb through whatever footage there is of early to mid 80s in the Portland area and in other areas, other cities, arcades, whatever, just to see if it could be spotted somewhere in the distance in the background, or even old photographs taken at arcades. Out of all of the thousands, tens of thousands, possibly hundreds of thousands of photographs taken in the 80s at arcades, is there a single one that possibly might show Polybius in the background somewhere? Now, obviously, if nobody really played the game and it was only out for a few days, I mean, that would totally narrow that possibility down, because then those photographs would had to be taken not only at the time that the Polybius cabinet was in the arcade, but also just to be visible in the background. Because if it's somewhere in an obscure back room in a corner, even if there were photos taken of people nearby, they would have had to feature that in the background, which, I mean, who knows if that happened. But I don't know if people even check for that. That would be curious if any photographs could ever be discovered that have Polybius in the distant background, however blurry. So that's it for this conspiratorial podcast in the realm of video games. Hope you guys enjoyed another edition of the MINDSHOCK podcast. If you want to help support the podcast, you can donate to our PayPal. Just check the link in the description. You can also become a YouTube member right here on YouTube for access to exclusive streams and chats. Make sure to subscribe to the podcast, like and share Twitter, Reddit, Facebook, and Patreon. This is Bruce McGuire signing off. Catch you guys next time.